My name is Sophia Brown. I am 29 years old. 2 years ago, I stood on the wraparound porch of our family farmhouse and watched my brother Wyatt hand his wife 2 black trash bags containing her clothes. He looked at the porch railing instead of her face and told her a barren wife was a dead end for the Lawson legacy. He said he needed a real future. My mother, Brenda, stood behind the screen door watching the woman who had loved my brother for 5 years carry those bags down the gravel driveway. My father was 50 feet away inspecting the tread on a tractor. Nobody offered her a ride. Nobody knew Clara was 4 weeks pregnant. I put Clara in my car and drove her 200 miles away to my apartment. 2 years later, at Wyatt's high society wedding, Clara walked into the reception hall holding his son. What she handed him dismantled a 40-year legacy in under 3 minutes. Welcome to Stillwater Stories. Before I tell you how an entire family's reputation fell apart on a dance floor, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. To understand how a family discards a human being like a broken appliance, you have to understand the soil they grew in. My mother was raised on the Mississippi Delta Plains. She survived her childhood on government cheese-patched clothes, and the harsh reality that land was the only thing separating you from the dust. When she married my father Dale and got her name on the deed to 400 acres of timber and pasture in the Ozarks legacy, became her religion. Wyatt was her golden investment, the heir to the acreage. When Clara sat at the kitchen table that Tuesday and whispered that her latest fertility treatments had failed, Brenda did not offer a hug. She initiated a teardown. I was sitting at the kitchen island with my laptop running security diagnostics for my firm when Brenda poured herself a glass of iced tea and delivered the verdict. She said a farm needs blood to keep it running, and if Clara could not provide it, she was holding Wyatt hostage. Wyatt sat there tracing the grain of the wood table. He did not defend his wife. He just nodded. The discard happened 3 hours later. The August heat was thick enough to wear. Clara was sitting on the porch steps, her shoulders shaking, trying to process how 5 years of marriage ended between lunch and dinner. Wyatt brought the trash bags out and dropped them near her feet. He mumbled about needing to be practical before the Razorback tailgating season started, like he was rescheduling a dentist appointment instead of ending a marriage. I looked at my dad. Dale was wiping grease off his hands with an old rag by the barn. Back in the 90s, a farming accident nearly took his left leg. Brenda changed his bandages, managed the farmhands, and kept the bank away. Dale traded his voice for his survival a long time ago. He just kept wiping the grease, ignoring the sound of Clara crying. I closed my laptop, walked down the porch steps, and picked up the trash bags. I told Clara to get in my car. We left the farm behind. That was the last time I spoke to my family before the truth caught up with them. The drive down Highway 65 felt like a funeral procession for a person who was still breathing in the passenger seat. 200 miles of black asphalt stretching through the foothills of the Ozarks, straightening out into the dense, humid flatlands of the Arkansas River Valley. Clara did not speak for the first 3 hours. She just stared at the passing pine trees, her hands gripping a cheap faux leather purse like it was a life preserver. I gripped the steering wheel, running the mental calculations of a sudden, brutal eviction. The August heat baked the dashboard, radiating through the windshield despite the air conditioning running at full blast. My apartment in Little Rock was a cramped third-floor walk-up built in the late 80s. The cooling unit rattled in the window, struggling against the oppressive southern humidity. The living room doubled as my command center. I am a cybersecurity analyst contracted by regional banks across the state to monitor malware threats and network intrusions. My life is structured around identifying vulnerabilities, neutralizing them, and patching the system before the damage spreads. 3 heavy monitors took up the entire dining table, displaying lines of code server statuses and traffic logs. Clara walked in, looked around the small space filled with boxes of takeout containers and tangles of Ethernet cables, and her shoulders slumped. The stark contrast between the sprawling 400-acre timber farm she had called home and my sterile digital bunker was jarring. She had married my brother 5 years ago. At 20, she dropped out of community college to manage the farm payroll coordinate, the agricultural supply logistics, and cook for the seasonal farmhands during the winter wheat harvest. Brenda told her early on that the farm was a family enterprise, which was a convenient way of saying Clara worked 60-hour weeks for free building equity she did not legally own. Now at 25, she had no college degree, no independent bank account, no marketable resume, and 2 black trash bags of denim and cotton to her name. I gave her my bed and took the lumpy sofa in the living room. For 3 days, our routine was a strained, uncomfortable dance of avoidance. I logged onto secure servers at dawn, tracking ransomware groups operating out of Eastern Europe, while Clara laid in the dark bedroom staring at the ceiling fan. I wanted to fix her situation, but you cannot write a script to patch a broken human being. I was furious at Wyatt for his cowardice. I was furious at my father for standing by the tractor and letting it happen to preserve his own peace. Most of all, I was furious that the burden of basic human decency always seemed to fall on the women in this family who refused to play by Brenda's ruthless rules. The breaking point hit on Thursday evening. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift auditing a compromised banking server when I heard a heavy thud from the bathroom down the hall. I dropped my headset onto the desk and ran. Clara was sitting on the cheap beige linoleum, her back pressed hard against the side of the bathtub. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and she was hyperventilating, pulling in jagged, shallow breaths that sounded like tearing paper. Her hand was shaking so hard the white plastic stick she held was vibrating against her shin. I crouched down and pulled the stick from her fingers. 2 dark pink lines. If this were a Hollywood script, this is the moment I would have dropped to my knees, wrapped my arms around her, and cried tears of joy about the miracle of life. But real life in a cramped Little Rock apartment does not come with a swelling orchestral soundtrack or soft lighting. Real life is terrifying. I did not offer comfort. I panicked. The pressure of the last 3 days, the exhaustion of my job, and the sheer impossibility of the situation boiled over into raw anger. "What the hell are we supposed to do with a baby, Clara?" I yelled, my voice cracking off the bathroom tile. I grabbed a hand towel from the rack and threw it into the empty bathtub, the slap of the fabric echoing in the small room. I work 60 hours a week analyzing threat vectors. I barely have time to buy groceries. You do not even have a job. You do not have health insurance. My brother just threw you out like garbage. How is this happening right now? Clara did not argue. She did not defend herself. She just sat on the floor, covering her face with both hands, letting out dry, heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. I could not stay in the room. The walls felt like they were shrinking, closing in on my chest. I walked out into the narrow hallway and paced. 10 steps to the front door, 10 steps back to the bedroom door. I swore at the ceiling. I dragged my hands through my hair, pulling at the roots until my scalp burned. My chest felt tight, bound by heavy iron bands of sheer logistical terror. Babies require money stability, pediatrician visits, cribs, and space. We had none of those things. I was a single woman living on black coffee and takeout, protecting corporate bank data from thousands of miles away. I was not equipped to build a nursery or raise a child. The math running through my head was brutal and unforgiving. I paced for 10 full minutes. The sound of Clara weeping in the bathroom grated against my nerves, a relentless reminder of the mess Wyatt left behind. I wanted to call him. I wanted to drive back up Highway 65, drag him off that farm by his collar, and force him to look at the collateral damage of his clean slate. But as I stood by the front door staring at the brass deadbolt, the panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. If I called Wyatt, he would tell Brenda. If Brenda found out about this child, she would view the baby as property, a genetic asset to the Lawson legacy. She would use the farm wealth to hire ruthless lawyers, rip the child from Clara's arms through the Arkansas family courts, and raise my nephew in the same toxic soil that produced my brother. Brenda would teach that child that people are disposable resources. I could not let that happen. I walked back down the hallway and stopped at the bathroom door. Clara had stopped sobbing, but her breathing was still erratic and heavy. Her face was red and swollen, her eyes fixed blindly on the grout lines of the tile floor. I slid down the drywall and sat next to her. The linoleum was cold through my jeans. We sat shoulder to shoulder for a long time. I did not have the perfect words to make it better. I did not have a 5-year plan. I just had the stubborn refusal to let my mother win this game. I took a deep breath, letting the stale apartment air fill my lungs, forcing my heart rate to slow down. "We are going to figure this out," I said, my voice low and steady. "It will be ugly and it will be hard, but you are not going back there. They do not get to claim this child." Clara turned her head, looking at me with eyes that were hollowed out by betrayal, but desperately searching for an anchor. She gave a single microscopic nod. I pushed myself up off the floor and offered her my hand. I pulled her up, steered her down the hallway toward the living room, and sat her down on the sofa. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a paper filter, and started brewing a pot of dark roast coffee. The smell of the bitter grounds grounded me, a familiar sensory routine in the middle of domestic chaos. I grabbed my primary laptop, the heavy machine I use for deep data audits, and carried it to the coffee table. I flipped the lid open. The screen glowed, casting a harsh blue light across the dim living room. "You are staying here," I told Clara, handing her a ceramic mug of black coffee. "We need to secure your digital identity right now. We need to lock down your social security number, pull your credit reports, and figure out exactly what Wyatt is hiding in his personal accounts. Because he is going to file for divorce fast to clear his name for the upcoming tailgating season, and we need to be ready for the financial paperwork he is going to try to force you to sign." The thick manila envelope arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday afternoon. It was heavy, packed with premium legal paper, and carried the return address of the most expensive family law firm in Fayetteville. Wyatt did not waste any time. He wanted a clean slate, and he wanted it before the first week of September. In the Ozarks, autumn means the start of the Razorback football tailgating season. It is not just a sporting event. It is a high society showcase. The sprawling white tents outside Donald W. Reynolds Razorback Stadium are where the wealthy agricultural families of Arkansas gather to drink bourbon, negotiate land leases, and display their perfect lineages. Wyatt could not show up to the VIP tailgates with the lingering shadow of a barren wife holding back the Lawson legacy. He needed to be seen as a free man ready to re-enter the dating market and secure a proper heir. To achieve that, he pushed his high-priced lawyers to draft an expedited, uncontested divorce decree. The strategy was clear. Overwhelm Clara with aggressive legal jargon and an impossible deadline, forcing her to fold before she had the energy to fight back. He calculated correctly regarding her energy levels, but for the wrong reasons. Clara was in no condition to wage a legal war. The first trimester of her pregnancy was treating her with ruthless hostility. She spent her mornings kneeling on the cheap linoleum of my bathroom floor, throwing up whatever meager dinner she had managed to swallow the night before. By mid-afternoon, she was so depleted she could barely hold a glass of water without her hands shaking. The emotional toll of the discard, combined with the extreme hormonal shifts, left her pale and hollowed out. I brought the manila envelope into the living room and dropped it onto the coffee table. Clara was lying on the sofa, wrapped in a fleece blanket despite the August heat radiating through the window. She stared at the thick stack of papers with dead, exhausted eyes. She did not want to hire a lawyer. She did not want to demand half the farm equipment or fight for a cut of the timber profits. She just wanted the crushing weight of the Lawson family off her chest. I sat down next to her and began reading through the decree page by page. I am not a lawyer, but my career in cybersecurity requires a paranoid level of attention to detail. I hunt for loopholes, hidden backdoors, and logic traps written into thousands of lines of code. Reading a legal contract uses the same mental muscles. Wyatt and his legal team had constructed a document designed to strip Clara of everything. The paperwork stated that neither party had any claim to future spousal support. It divided the shared property with laughable inequality, leaving Clara with a modest lump sum that would barely cover 6 months of rent in Little Rock. But on page 14, buried in the dense boilerplate text regarding final asset division, I found the anomaly. To ensure Clara could never come back and claim a share of the farm yields, Wyatt had signed a binding, irrevocable waiver. The clause explicitly stated that he permanently abandoned any right claim or interest to all undisclosed assets or dependents moving forward. Wyatt thought he was building a fortress around his bank accounts. He wanted to make sure that if Clara suddenly remembered a hidden savings account or a piece of machinery, she could never touch it. But in his rush to lock down his wealth, his lawyers used broad, sweeping language. He signed away his rights to any undisclosed dependents. He was legally severing his ties to a child he did not even know existed. I read the paragraph 3 times to ensure I was interpreting the English correctly. My heart pounded against my ribs. The sheer arrogance of his greed had provided us with the exact shield we needed. I handed Clara a blue ink pen. I pointed to the signature line on the final page. I told her to sign it. We drove to a local bank branch that same afternoon, paid a notary $5 to stamp the seal, and dropped the envelope in a priority mail bin. Wyatt got his uncontested divorce in record time. He thought he won. But the legal victory did not stop my professional curiosity. In the state of Arkansas, even in an expedited, uncontested divorce, the parties are required to submit basic financial discovery. It is a routine exchange of joint bank statements to prove neither side is acting in bad faith. Wyatt included a thick stack of printed ledgers covering their shared checking and savings accounts for the past 24 months. I carried those statements back to my apartment and spread them out across my dining table. The glow of my 3 computer monitors illuminated the rows of black and white text. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, cracked my knuckles, and went to work. I did not just read the numbers. I imported the data into my audit software, tracking the flow of capital out of their joint accounts. It took me 4 hours to find the pattern. It was not a single glaring mistake. It was a methodical bleed. Large, unexplained cash withdrawals began appearing on the statements exactly 2 years ago. $4,000 withdrawn on a Tuesday, $7,000 transferred the following month. Always kept carefully under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering an automatic bank inquiry. The withdrawals accelerated during the winter months right after the farm sold off its seasonal timber yields. I sat back in my desk chair and stared at the screen. Wyatt had not suddenly decided Clara was useless to the family legacy. He had been quietly siphoning money out of their shared accounts long before the fertility treatments failed. He had been preparing to financially starve her while staging his eventual exit. Have you ever looked at a simple piece of paper and realized the person you trusted had been plotting against you for years? Tell me about that moment in the comments. The urge to print out the audit logs, drive up to Fayetteville, and throw the evidence in his face was a hot, burning pressure in my chest. If we took this to a judge right now, we could halt the divorce and demand a full forensic accounting of the Lawson estate. We could force him to return the stolen funds. But I looked over at the sofa. Clara was fast asleep, her breathing shallow and uneven, her skin carrying a sickly gray undertone. The stress of a protracted, vicious legal battle over hidden money would break her physically. It could trigger a miscarriage. The priority was not revenge. The priority was the survival of the child growing inside her. I made the hardest tactical decision of my life. I gathered the bank statements and scanned them into high-resolution digital files. I transferred the entire audit log along with the highlighted anomalies onto a heavy-duty encrypted hard drive. I locked the hard drive inside a fireproof metal strongbox and shoved it under my bed. I put the evidence on ice. The reckoning would have to wait. Meanwhile, news from the Ozarks traveled fast. Wyatt did not waste a single day mourning his marriage. By the second week of September, the tailgating season was in full swing, and Wyatt was holding court under the white tents. He had a new accessory on his arm. Her name was Savannah. She was 22 years old, the daughter of a prominent local dealership owner who specialized in selling heavy agricultural machinery. She was local old money, eager to step into the role of a wealthy farm wife. Wyatt paraded her through the local diners and country clubs, grinning wide and buying rounds of drinks for his friends. He controlled the narrative perfectly. He painted Clara as a fragile, unstable woman who cracked under the pressure of farm life and walked away. He played the role of the resilient, hard-working farmer starting a fresh chapter. My mother Brenda fueled the gossip mill, whispering to the church ladies that Wyatt had finally found a girl with strong roots and a good pedigree. Wyatt was drinking expensive bourbon in VIP tents, bragging about his new younger girlfriend. Clara was sitting in a cramped apartment chewing on ice chips to keep her prenatal vitamins down. The injustice of it made my jaw ache. We were operating as ghosts, hiding in plain sight while my family celebrated their perceived triumph. But the real world does not care about your carefully crafted social image. The real world demands payment, and it usually arrives when you are most vulnerable. As Clara moved into her second trimester, the initial relief of escaping the farm was shattered by a stark medical reality. The quiet sanctuary we built in Little Rock was about to be tested by a crisis that no encrypted hard drive could solve. Real life does not care about your need for justice. It operates on a cold, indifferent timeline, and it only demands payment. November arrived in Little Rock with a bitter, damp chill that seeped through the thin windows of my apartment. Clara was 26 weeks along. Her stomach had finally rounded out a visible testament to the child she was carrying. The pregnancy was taking a brutal physical toll, but we attributed the exhaustion to the stress of the forced divorce. It started on a Tuesday evening. Clara complained of a headache that felt like a tight steel band wrapped around her temples. I brought her a glass of water and some acetaminophen, but an hour later her vision began to blur. I looked at her hands and feet. They were swollen, the skin pulled tight and shiny, retaining fluid at an alarming rate. I did not wait for her to tell me she felt worse. I grabbed my car keys, helped her into a heavy winter coat, and drove straight to the emergency room at the University Medical Center. The triage nurse took one look at her blood pressure reading and hit a blue button on the wall. The urgency in the room spiked. Medical staff swarmed the tiny curtained cubicle. A doctor with dark circles under his eyes stepped in and explained that Clara had developed severe preeclampsia. Her blood pressure was reaching critical levels, threatening her major organs and restricting blood flow to the baby. There was no time to wait, no time to try and stabilize her with prolonged bed rest. They had to deliver the child immediately to save both of their lives. I stood in the sterile hospital hallway, clutching Clara's winter coat against my chest, watching a team of nurses rush her surgical bed through a set of swinging double doors. The smell of rubbing alcohol and industrial floor cleaner burned the back of my throat. It is a specific kind of terror, standing helpless in a corridor, trusting strangers with the two people you care about most. My nephew Jackson was born via emergency cesarean section at 2 a.m. He weighed 1 pound and 14 ounces. A pediatric specialist walked me into the neonatal intensive care unit a few hours later. The room was kept dim, filled with the rhythmic mechanical hum of life support machines. He led me to a clear plastic incubator. Jackson was impossibly small. His skin was translucent, mapping a delicate web of blue and purple veins across his chest. A breathing tube was taped to his face, and countless wires connected his fragile body to monitors tracking every heartbeat and oxygen drop. He looked fragile enough to break if you breathed too heavily near the plastic casing. Clara was heavily medicated, recovering in a postpartum ward 2 floors up, fighting her own battle to stabilize her dangerous blood pressure. I stood next to the incubator watching Jackson's tiny chest rise and fall in time with the ventilator. He had Wyatt's exact jawline even at that microscopic size, a genetic carbon copy of the man currently sipping bourbon under a white tent in Fayetteville. The anger flared in my chest, but I pushed it down. Anger is a luxury you cannot afford when survival is the only priority. The emotional terror of the NICU was swiftly followed by the crushing weight of modern American bureaucracy. 3 days after Jackson was born, a woman from the hospital billing department knocked on Clara's door. She carried an electronic tablet and wore a sympathetic expression that did not reach her eyes. When Wyatt rushed the uncontested divorce through the courts, he achieved his goal of a clean slate. But that clean slate carried secondary destruction. The moment the judge stamped the final decree, Clara was dropped from the Premium Agricultural Association healthcare plan Wyatt held. She was uninsured when she was admitted to the emergency room. The hospital social worker helped us apply for the state emergency Medicaid program, but the coverage was deeply flawed. The state plan covered a portion of the delivery, but it left gaping holes in the specialized round-the-clock intensive care Jackson required. The daily cost of a NICU incubator, the respiratory therapists, the feeding tubes, and the constant specialist consultations accumulated at a staggering rate. We were drowning in debt before Jackson could even breathe on his own. There was no magical benefactor waiting in the wings to rescue us. My parents were wealthy, sitting on 400 acres of prime Ozark timber, but calling them meant surrendering Jackson to Brenda. I would rather walk into traffic than hand this child over to a woman who views human beings as farm assets to be managed and discarded. I left Clara sleeping in her hospital room and walked down to the cafeteria on the ground floor. It was 2 a.m. The cafeteria was empty, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast a sickening yellow pallor over the plastic tables. I bought a black coffee and sat in a corner booth, pulling a yellow legal pad and a pen from my laptop bag. I am a cybersecurity analyst. My brain is wired to solve complex systemic failures. I started listing our liabilities. Clara was physically incapacitated and unable to work. She had 0 income. The collection agencies would not wait for her to heal. They would secure court orders, garnish whatever meager wages she eventually earned, and trap her in a permanent cycle of poverty. The medical debt would crush her before she even had a chance to learn how to be a mother. I looked at my own assets. When I graduated college and landed my first corporate contract at 22, I opened a Vanguard retirement account. I funneled 20% of every paycheck into that fund. I drove a rusted sedan, skipped vacations, and lived in a cramped apartment so I could build a financial fortress. I wanted to buy a small house with a yard. I wanted total independence. I opened my banking application on my phone and stared at the balance. 7 years of disciplined, quiet sacrifice. It was enough to cover the gaps in the Medicaid billing. It was enough to keep the predatory debt collectors away from Clara. If I cashed it out early, the federal government would penalize me. The IRS mandates a 10% early withdrawal fee on top of standard income taxes. I would lose thousands of dollars just for accessing my own money. It was financial self-sabotage. I sat under those buzzing fluorescent lights, staring at the screen until my eyes burned. The choice was brutal. Protect my future or protect my family. But as I thought about that tiny, translucent boy fighting for his next breath inside a plastic box upstairs, the decision simplified. Money is a tool. If you do not use the tool when the house is on fire, you are just hoarding ash. Have you ever sat under harsh fluorescent lights looking at a medical bill and calculating exactly how many years of your future it would cost to pay it off? Tell me in the comments. At 8 in the morning, I called my brokerage firm. The hold music played a tinny, cheerful melody that starkly contrasted with the reality of draining my life savings. A broker named David came on the line. He sounded young, reading from a required compliance script informing me about the severe tax implications of an early liquidation. I told him I understood. He asked if I wanted to withhold the estimated taxes from the distribution or pay them during the spring tax season. I told him to withhold them, knowing I could not risk a secondary audit from the federal government later. The transaction required verbal confirmation's identity verification and a digital signature. With those few bureaucratic steps, 7 years of careful financial planning evaporated. The money hit my primary checking account 2 days later. I marched straight into the hospital billing department, sat down across from the woman with the electronic tablet, and started paying invoices. I paid the anesthesiologist. I paid the neonatal specialist group. I cleared the balance for the emergency surgery. When I walked back into the NICU that afternoon, my bank account was nearly empty, but Clara's name was clear. The collection agencies had no leverage. Wyatt's financial starvation tactic had failed. Jackson spent 84 days in the neonatal unit. 84 days of scrubbing my hands with iodine soap, wearing yellow isolation gowns, and watching monitors trace the unsteady rhythm of his heart. The alarms in the NICU beeped in different pitches, each one signaling a different metric. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiration. Every time an alarm sounded near Jackson's enclosure, Clara would stop breathing until a nurse silenced it. We learned the clinical vocabulary of premature survival. We learned to read the monitors before the nurses even walked over. Clara pumped breast milk, sang soft lullabies through the plastic incubator walls, and slowly pieced her own shattered physical strength back together. We celebrated his milestones not with parties but with quiet sighs of relief. The day he breathed without the ventilator. The day he held his body temperature stable. The day he finally hit 5 pounds. Every ounce of weight he gained felt like a victory against the Lawson family. When we finally brought him home to my Little Rock apartment, the winter chill had broken, giving way to an early spring. I carried his car seat up the 3 flights of stairs, my muscles aching from exhaustion. We set up a small crib in the corner of my bedroom right next to my desk, where my 3 monitors still hummed with banking data. We were broke. We were exhausted. But we were safe. We had weathered the first terrible storm, securing Jackson's life and Clara's freedom. The physical crisis was over, but the reality of raising a child in secret was just beginning. We had to build a sustainable routine far away from the Ozark, stepping into a grueling, silent endurance test while Wyatt paraded around Fayetteville, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering on his horizon. For 24 months, we operated as ghosts. We built a perimeter around our lives in Little Rock, erasing our digital and physical footprints from the northern counties of the state. I installed heavy blackout curtains over the apartment windows to keep the brutal summer heat from frying my server racks. Behind those curtains, we established a quiet, grueling routine. I worked my cybersecurity contracts during the day, auditing corporate firewalls and securing banking networks across the region. Clara took the night shifts. She found a remote data entry position for a regional trucking logistics company, typing shipping manifests into a cloud database from 9 in the evening until 3 in the morning. She traded the vast open fields of the farm for the glow of a single desk lamp in the corner of my living room. We were exhausted, running on dark roast coffee and survival instincts. But the constant motion kept the panic at bay. As Jackson grew, we had to find safe places to let him experience the world outside our drywall bunker. We could not risk the sprawling parks in Fayetteville or the popular hiking trails in the Ozarks, where my parents held immense social influence. Instead, we drove north to Mountain View. The town sits in a deep valley, functioning as a living archive of Arkansas folk traditions. On warm Saturday evenings, the town square filled with local musicians carrying acoustic guitars, upright basses, and fiddles. We spread a quilt on the grass under the shade of a large oak tree. Clara bought Jackson a set of smooth wooden blocks from a local craftsman. He sat on the blanket banging the blocks together in rough time, with the bluegrass bands playing on the stone gazebo. The music was raw and unpolished, echoing off the brick storefronts. We ate fried catfish and hush puppies from paper baskets, watching the river cut its path through the Delta Plains. These excursions were our sanctuary, but they also carried a sharp edge of risk. Jackson was growing into a sturdy, loud toddler, and his face was a precise biological roadmap back to the people we were hiding from. He had Wyatt's exact square jawline and the distinctive stubborn tilt of Brenda's chin. Every time he scowled because his wooden blocks toppled over in the grass, I saw my mother staring back at me. It was a daily visual test of my endurance. We were raising the sole heir to a 400-acre agricultural empire on a budget of discounted groceries and secondhand clothes. While we ate catfish by the river, my parents were busy rewriting history. In my line of work, monitoring threat vectors requires gathering continuous intelligence on the opposition. Once a month, I used a secured proxy server to scan the digital social circles of Fayetteville. Wyatt and Savannah were planning the high society event of the decade. Their engagement photos featured them standing in front of a restored vintage tractor. Savannah wearing a designer silk dress and Wyatt looking like the rugged, triumphant survivor. Brenda was the chief architect of their public image. She utilized the country club luncheons and the Sunday morning church vestibule to distribute her narrative. She told the wealthy landowners and the local politicians that Clara had cracked under the demanding pressure of farm life. She painted a picture of a mentally fragile woman who packed her bags in the middle of the night and abandoned her duties, leaving Wyatt brokenhearted and the farm vulnerable. The community bought the lie without requesting a single receipt. They wanted to attend the lavish hunting lodge wedding, so they eagerly accepted the fiction that Clara was the villain. I looked at a digital copy of Savannah's bridal registry. The cost of her requested floral arrangements alone matched the exact dollar amount of Jackson's first week in the neonatal intensive care unit. Enduring that lie required a physical restraint I did not know I possessed. I grew up hunting on those private land leases. I knew the sharp, cold smell of damp pine needles before dawn. I knew the sound of boots crunching on frost, the weight of a rifle sling on my shoulder, and the exact taste of the pecan pies Brenda baked every Thanksgiving. Living in a third-floor walk up above a noisy intersection in Little Rock felt like breathing through a straw. The ceiling of the apartment was too low. The hallway was narrow. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the constant hum of commercial traffic. Our living space was a confined box pressing down on our shoulders. There were days when the urge to drive up Highway 65, kick the heavy oak doors of the country club open, and drop a DNA test on Brenda's pristine white tablecloth nearly consumed me. I kept my car keys in the desk drawer. Exposing the truth meant exposing Jackson to the family machinery. Brenda did not view children as individuals requiring nurture and patience. She viewed them as structural pillars for the Lawson legacy. If she knew Jackson existed, she would not offer apologies or open her home. She would deploy her vast financial resources to hire a team of ruthless litigators. She would drag Clara through a punishing custody battle, framing her as an unfit, destitute mother living in a cramped urban apartment. Brenda would win joint custody through sheer financial attrition, and Jackson would be dragged up to the Ozarks on weekends to be molded into a replica of my brother. He would be taught to value acreage over human decency. The oppressive peace of our exile was the only shield we had to offer him. 2 years of silence breeds a dangerous illusion of permanent safety. You start to believe the perimeter you built is impenetrable. Jackson turned 2 in the middle of a suffocating July heat wave. The cooling unit in our apartment window finally gave out, grinding to a halt and leaving us baking in stagnant 90-degree air. Clara looked at me, wiping sweat from Jackson's forehead with a damp cloth. We needed a break from the asphalt and the concrete. We decided to pack an overnight bag and drive an hour southwest to Hot Springs. The city is nestled in the Ouachita Mountains, famous for its historic bathhouse row and the cool, shaded promenades winding through the national park. Decades ago, it was a thermal retreat for notorious gangsters and baseball legends looking to escape the heat. Today, it is a tourist destination far outside the typical orbit of the Fayetteville agricultural elite. We thought we were invisible. We thought we had successfully severed the cord binding us to the Lawson name. We packed the rusted sedan, left the sweltering apartment behind, and drove straight toward a collision that would burn our quiet ghost life to the ground. The Ouachita Mountains are older and rounder than the Ozarks up north. Deep beneath the surface, geological pressure forces water upward through fault lines, heating it to 140 degrees before it spills out of the hillside. The town of Hot Springs was built around this natural thermal anomaly. For over a century, the grand bathhouses lining Central Avenue have drawn people seeking healing, recreation, and refuge. The town has a rich history of harboring individuals trying to escape their present reality. Decades ago, infamous figures rented out entire floors of the grand hotels to hide from federal authorities. We thought we were simply continuing the local tradition of seeking sanctuary in the steam and the shadows of the valley. The sweltering July heatwave had finally broken the cooling unit in our cramped Little Rock apartment. We needed an escape from the stagnant air and the concrete pavement. We packed a small overnight bag, loaded Jackson into his car seat, and drove the hour southwest. It was a picturesque Saturday afternoon. We walked under the heavy, dark green shade of the magnolia trees along the Grand Promenade. Clara looked radiant. The hollow, exhausted circles under her eyes had faded long ago. She had reclaimed her health and her dignity through sheer daily endurance. We bought Jackson a cup of vanilla ice cream and watched him point at the horse-drawn carriages clattering down the brick-paved street. We felt safe. We felt invisible. But invisibility is a fragile, temporary construct. In my profession as a cybersecurity analyst, a zero-day exploit is a critical vulnerability in a digital system that the software creators do not know exists. You have 0 days to fix the flaw before the network is compromised by hostile actors. The breach is usually silent, sudden, and devastating. Our physical firewall was breached not by a sophisticated attack, but by a random twist of geographic misfortune. We walked into a local barbecue restaurant a few blocks away from the tourist-heavy bathhouse row. The floorboards were scuffed hardwood, the walls decorated with vintage Arkansas license plates, and faded black and white photographs of Delta blues musicians. The air inside was thick with the scent of hickory wood smoke, sweet vinegar sauce, and deep-fried okra. The place was packed with weekend visitors and loud families. The overlapping conversations and the clatter of heavy ceramic plates provided a comfortable, distracting white noise. We secured a wooden booth in the far corner of the dining room. I sat facing the entrance. It was a tactical habit I developed living in constant anticipation of discovery. Clara wore a simple cotton sundress, her hair tied back in a loose knot. Jackson was sitting in a wooden high chair at the end of our table. He was wearing a tiny denim shirt and struggling to manage a pulled pork sandwich that I had cut into small squares. He was making a spectacular mess. The thick, dark barbecue sauce was smeared across his cheeks and chin. I watched him chew his food and felt a familiar, sharp pang of anxiety. He was 2 years old now. The soft infant features were melting away, revealing the underlying structural genetics. He was a Lawson. The square jawline, the wide-set eyes, the distinct shape of his brow. You could not deny his lineage if you held a photograph of Wyatt next to his face. The heavy brass bell above the diner door chimed loudly over the ambient noise. A wave of high-pitched laughter spilled into the dining room. I looked up from my plate of brisket. 6 young women walked through the entrance. They wore matching pink sash ribbons draped over their shoulders. It was a bachelorette party, a very common sight in a resort town on a summer weekend. Then the bride stepped through the wooden doorframe and the air in my lungs turned to ice. Savannah was 22 years old. She was raised on a sprawling, pristine estate just outside Fayetteville. Her father owned the largest agricultural machinery dealership in 3 counties. Savannah was local old money, accustomed to a life where unpleasant problems were handled quietly behind closed doors with large checks and strict non-disclosure agreements. She was groomed to host charity galas and manage a flawless social calendar. She expected her upcoming marriage to Wyatt to be a flawless coronation. Her entire worldview was built upon the foundation of the lie my mother had carefully constructed and sold to the public. Savannah believed Clara was a fragile, unstable failure who abandoned her duties, leaving Wyatt as the stoic, hard-working survivor. She wore a white silk romper and a sash that read, "Future Mrs. Lawson" in bright gold glitter lettering. My training dictates that when a perimeter is breached, you do not freeze. You assess the threat level and secure the remaining data. But I could not move. Savannah stopped halfway to the ordering counter, scanning the crowded room for an open table large enough to accommodate her bridal party. Her gaze swept across the diner and landed directly on our corner booth. The visual collision happened in distinct, agonizing stages. She recognized me first, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. Sophia Brown was supposed to be a bitter, isolated tech worker living in the city, entirely estranged from the Lawson family. Then she saw Clara sitting next to me. The ghost. The unstable ex-wife who vanished into the night. Savannah stopped breathing. I watched her throat swallow hard as her brain tried to process the impossible data in front of her. Then her line of sight dropped to the wooden high chair. Jackson banged a sticky fist against his plastic tray, letting out a loud, demanding laugh because he dropped a piece of pork on the floor. He looked up. Savannah stared at the toddler with the barbecue sauce smeared across his jaw. She saw Wyatt. She saw the exact, undeniable biological replica of the man she was scheduled to marry in less than a month. The math was simple and devastating. A 2-year-old child meant Clara was pregnant before the divorce was finalized. It meant Wyatt either abandoned his own blood to start a new life, or he was too foolish to know his own child existed. Either scenario instantly destroyed the pristine, honorable image Savannah had bought into. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic, tearful confrontation in the middle of the crowded restaurant. Savannah belonged to a social class that abhorred public scenes. She stood frozen for 5 agonizing seconds. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and pale under the glow of the neon beer signs hanging in the window. Her chest heaved once. She turned on her heel, pushed past her confused bridesmaids, and walked straight out the glass door into the sweltering heat. She already had her phone pressed to her ear before her sandals hit the concrete sidewalk. Clara dropped her paper napkin onto her plate. Her hands started to shake. The safety perimeter we spent 24 months building had just collapsed in a matter of seconds. She looked at me, her eyes wide with the raw, familiar terror we had worked so hard to banish. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet, threw it onto the table, and pulled Jackson out of the high chair. I did not bother wiping the sauce off his face. We rushed out the side exit and strapped him into his car seat. The drive back down Interstate 30 to Little Rock was a silent, suffocating journey. The setting sun cast long, harsh shadows across the highway asphalt. I drove the exact speed limit, my mind racing through defensive protocols and legal strategies. The information was already in the wind. Savannah was calling my mother or Wyatt or her own powerful parents. The Fayetteville social structure was experiencing a seismic event, and the shockwaves were heading straight for our apartment. Our 2 years of hard-earned peace were officially terminated. We were no longer ghosts hiding in the shadows. We were targets. I parked the rusted sedan in the alley behind our building and locked the deadbolt on our front door, knowing that sleep would not come tonight. We sat in the dim living room listening to the hum of the city traffic outside, waiting for the digital strike that would inevitably arrive with the dawn. The digital clock on my bedside table flipped to 6 in the morning. I had not slept a single minute. The apartment was trapped in that heavy gray stillness that happens just before the sun breaks over the Little Rock skyline. Clara was curled on her side in the bed across the room, her breathing shallow and restless. Jackson was asleep in his crib, oblivious to the fact that his existence was currently tearing a fault line through the Ozarks. I was sitting on the floor with my back against the locked front door, drinking cold coffee from a paper cup, waiting for the retaliation. When my phone illuminated the dim hallway, the sudden vibration against the hardwood floor sounded like a warning siren. The screen displayed a Fayetteville area code. Below the numbers, a name I had not spoken aloud in 24 months flashed in bright white text: Brenda Lawson. My training in network defense relies on predicting the adversary's entry point and bracing for the impact. I expected a full frontal assault. I anticipated legal threats, shouting, and the familiar cutting tone my mother used to manage farmhands and silence my father. I took a deep breath, braced my spine against the drywall, and swiped the green icon to accept the call. I held the phone to my ear and said nothing. I wanted her to speak first. The sound coming through the receiver shattered every defensive protocol I had prepared. Brenda was not shouting. She was weeping. It was not the theatrical performative crying she deployed at church luncheons to gather sympathy. It was a raw, guttural sound, the sound of a person having the air knocked out of their lungs. The audio quality was sharp enough that I could hear her gasping for breath. "Is he real, Sophia?" Her voice trembled, breaking on the final syllable. "Is that my grandson?" For a fraction of a second, the iron-plated matriarch of the Lawson estate vanished. In her place, I heard the broken dirt poor girl from the Mississippi Delta. Growing up, Brenda rarely talked about her childhood. She kept her history locked away, but the fragments I managed to piece together painted a grim picture. She grew up in a rusted, single-wide trailer sinking into the mud of the floodplains. She survived on government surplus cheese and the bitter knowledge that poverty makes you invisible. When she married Dale and secured her name on the deed to the Ozark farm, she swore she would build something permanent. She built her legacy the way a survivor builds a bunker, hoarding resources and fortifying the walls. A family bloodline was not about love for Brenda. It was about permanence. It was the only thing standing between her and the mud. Hearing her cry for the grandson she did not know existed dug a sharp, painful hook into my chest. Despite 2 years of silence, she was still my mother. A small buried part of my brain wanted to soften, to offer her reassurance, to tell her that Jackson was healthy and strong and beautiful. But survival requires a ruthless memory. I remembered the trash bags on the porch. I remembered the emergency room monitors beeping in the middle of the night. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste copper and waited. The vulnerability lasted exactly 15 seconds. I listened as the tears stopped. I heard the sharp intake of a long breath. I heard a chair scrape against the hardwood floor of the farmhouse kitchen 200 miles away. When Brenda spoke again, the Delta survivor was gone. The warden had returned. "You bring that boy back to Fayetteville right now." The command was delivered in a low, hardened tone, stripped of any maternal warmth. Clara has no right to keep the Lawson bloodline hidden in some cramped city apartment. Savannah called me from a parking lot in Hot Springs having a panic attack. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to Wyatt?" "The wedding is in 3 weeks, Sophia. We have a reputation to fix. You are going to pack his things and you are going to drive him up here today." She did not ask how Jackson survived the premature birth. She did not ask if Clara was healthy. She did not apologize for forcing a pregnant woman out of her home. The tears were not born from a desire to heal her family. They were the tears of a property owner realizing a valuable asset had been located off her land. My chest tightened, a familiar childhood panic rising in my throat. For a moment, I felt like I was 12 years old again, standing in the kitchen and being scolded for leaving mud on the pristine hardwood floors. But I was not a child anymore. I was a cybersecurity analyst who had liquidated her entire future to keep this boy alive. I did not deliver a perfect, calculated response. My emotions were a chaotic, messy knot of rage, exhaustion, and residual fear. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone. "He is not a tractor, Mom." I yelled, my voice cracking humiliatingly loud in the quiet hallway. "You cannot just claim him because the lease is up and your reputation is taking a hit. You threw his mother out like garbage. You do not get to rewrite history just because Savannah saw a ghost in a barbecue joint." Brenda let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Clara was a weak link, Sophia. She could not handle the farm, and she hid this child out of spite. Wyatt is his father. He has a legal right to his heir. You are harboring stolen property, and if you do not bring him to me, I will send the lawyers. Have you ever tried to reason with a parent who views human beings as line items on a balance sheet? Let me know in the comments how you finally broke the cycle." I did not try to reason with her. I did not try to explain the intensive care bills or the uncontested divorce decree. You do not negotiate with a threat actor when they have already declared war. If you send anyone near this apartment, I will call the police. I said, my breathing jagged and uneven. Jackson stays with the mother who actually kept him breathing. Do not call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. My hands were trembling visibly. I pressed my palms against my thighs, trying to force the adrenaline out of my system. The confrontation had been ugly. I had lost my temper. I had yelled. But the boundary was finally drawn. The 2-year Cold War had officially gone hot. Clara was standing in the doorway of the bedroom. She was wearing an oversized shirt, her arms wrapped tightly around her own torso. She had heard enough of the shouting to understand the situation. Her face was pale, but the terror I expected to see in her eyes was missing. Instead, there was a dull, resigned acceptance. They are coming for him. She whispered, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the refrigerator. They are going to try, I replied, pushing myself off the floor. I walked into the kitchen and poured the cold coffee down the sink. But we are not going to wait for them to strike first. I opened my primary laptop and bypassed my usual security feeds. I did not search for cyber threats. I searched the Arkansas State Bar Association registry. Brenda had wealth influence and a ruthless desire to protect the Lawson name at any cost. Wyatt had the motivation of a cornered animal trying to save his upcoming high society wedding. They were going to use the Arkansas family court system as a weapon to bludgeon Clara into submission. We needed a legal mercenary. We needed someone who did not care about the Fayetteville social hierarchy and who thrived on dismantling aggressive litigation. I spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing attorney reviews, disciplinary records, and case outcomes for family law practitioners in Pulaski County. I bypassed the firms that advertised mediation and collaborative divorce. I searched for the lawyers described as combative and relentless. By 8 in the morning, I had a name and a phone number written on a yellow sticky note. I dialed the office the second they opened. A paralegal answered the phone. I did not ask for a consultation. I told her I was initiating a defensive custody action against a wealthy agricultural family preparing to file a malicious paternity suit, and I needed an emergency retainer agreement drafted by noon. The reality of challenging my family's wealth felt like standing on the tracks while a freight train accelerated toward me. Brenda's threat about sending the lawyers was not an idle intimidation tactic. The Lawsons retained a powerful firm in Northwest Arkansas that handled their land disputes, equipment leases, and tax structuring. Those attorneys were sharks dressed in tailored suits, men who golfed with the local judges and donated heavily to political campaigns. We were going into battle with a fraction of their capital. I walked into the bedroom. Jackson was waking up in his crib, rubbing his eyes with his small fists. He let out a soft morning babble entirely innocent of the fact that he was the most contested asset in the state. Clara lifted him out of the crib and held him close to her chest. She buried her face in his soft hair. "We need to gather every document we have," I told her, my tone shifting into pure logistical operation mode. "We need the original divorce decree, the medical bills from the intensive care unit, the receipts from the emergency Medicaid, and proof of my retirement liquidation. We have to prove a documented history of total financial and physical abandonment. If Wyatt files for emergency custody, his angle will be parental alienation. He will claim, 'You hid the child to inflict emotional distress.' We have to prove he willfully blinded himself to the truth to protect his bank accounts." Clara nodded slowly. She placed Jackson in his high chair in the kitchen and handed him a plastic bowl of dry cereal. She walked over to the small filing cabinet tucked under my desk and began pulling out thick manila folders. For 2 years, she had meticulously cataloged every single expense, every doctor visit, and every agonizing milestone of Jackson's survival. She had transformed her trauma into a pristine paper trail. While Clara organized the physical documents, I accessed the encrypted hard drive hidden under my bed. I entered the decryption key, watching the progress bar load on my monitor. The digital ledgers I had archived during the rushed divorce were still there, preserved in perfect digital amber. I had held onto this data like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. The phone on my desk rang. It was the law office in downtown Little Rock. The attorney I had researched was ready to take our case, provided we could produce a substantial initial retainer fee by the end of the business day. The financial bleed was starting again. The money I had managed to rebuild since the hospital crisis was about to be wiped out by legal fees, but there was no alternative. Surrender meant losing Jackson. I confirmed the wire transfer details with the law firm and hung up. The defensive perimeter was set, but the incoming attack was going to be far worse than a simple phone call from my mother. Wyatt was backed into a corner, his lucrative marriage to Savannah hanging by a thread. He was going to use the courts to silence us, launching a legal ambush designed to bankrupt our resources and break our resolve before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. 72 hours after the phone call from Brenda, a man in a wrinkled polo shirt knocked on my apartment door. He did not ask how my morning was going. He confirmed Clara was present and handed her a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue clip. Wyatt did not call to ask about his son's favorite toys or inquire about his health. He dispatched a process server. Wyatt and his legal team filed an emergency injunction in the Pulaski County Family Court. Desperate to save face and secure his upcoming marriage to Savannah, he initiated a brutal offensive. The motion demanded immediate mandatory paternity testing and requested temporary physical custody of Jackson. The legal brief accused Clara of intentional concealment and calculated parental alienation. The paperwork claimed she hid the child with the sole intent to inflict severe emotional distress on a grieving ex-husband. Wyatt painted himself as a devoted patriarch, robbed of his lineage by a vindictive woman. He conveniently omitted the part where he handed her 2 trash bags on a humid August afternoon and rushed a divorce decree to free up his tailgating schedule. This was not a television procedural where a righteous judge bangs a wooden gavel and dismisses a fraudulent case before lunch. We were dragged into the sluggish, grueling nightmare of the Arkansas family court system. The courts are choked with backlogs, and the gears of justice grind with agonizing slowness. For 8 exhausting months, Clara and I lived our lives in 30-day increments, corresponding to the dates of upcoming hearings and mandatory filings. The financial bleed was instantaneous and relentless. Every email our lawyer sent, every motion she filed, and every phone call she answered generated a billable hour. Clara and I burned through our monthly paychecks just keeping our defensive lines active. I canceled my internet subscriptions, stopped buying fresh produce, and lived on cheap bulk rice and beans. The financial reserve I managed to rebuild after the neonatal intensive care crisis vanished into the trust account of a downtown law firm. We were paying thousands of dollars just to prove Clara had the right to keep the child she birthed and kept alive. The legal assault went far beyond courtroom filings. Wyatt utilized his wealth to petition for a comprehensive home environment evaluation. The court granted the request and appointed a guardian ad litem to inspect our living conditions. The evaluator was a woman named Barbara. She had spent 30 years working within the family court system and carried the tired, skeptical demeanor of someone who trusted paperwork more than people. She walked through our cramped third-floor walk-up with a clipboard, noting the limited square footage, the single shared bathroom, and the lack of a dedicated outdoor play area. Clara was terrified. She spent the 3 days prior to the inspection scrubbing the baseboards and organizing Jackson's modest collection of toys until her hands were raw. During the evaluation, she sat stiffly on the sofa, answering Barbara's probing questions about her remote data entry job and her lack of a college degree. The implication hung heavy in the stale apartment air. The court was comparing our noisy concrete surroundings and our meager bank balances against a 400-acre timber farm, a sprawling estate, and a multi-million-dollar agricultural trust fund. The system did not measure the love or the sacrifice required to navigate a premature birth without health insurance. It measured taxable income and square footage. Clara saw the math adding up against her, and the fear threatened to pull her back into the hollow depression she endured after the initial discard. The depositions were designed to break her spirit. We sat in a sterile conference room in a high-rise office building downtown facing a battery of lawyers hired by the Lawson estate. The lead attorney was a polished man who specialized in aggressive cross-examinations. For 6 hours he interrogated Clara about her mental stability during the pregnancy. He twisted her isolation during the neonatal crisis into a narrative of dangerous paranoia. He demanded to know why she never contacted Wyatt when the hospital bills piled up, implying she preferred to endanger her child rather than share custody. I sat next to her gripping a paper cup of water until the wax lining cracked. I watched this man in a tailored suit dissect my best friend using my mother's wealth as a scalpel. Clara held her ground, answering in short, measured sentences, but the emotional toll was visible in the rigid set of her shoulders and the dark circles returning under her eyes. The prolonged stress began to dismantle my own physical and professional stability. I stopped sleeping. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, running through worst-case scenarios where a judge ordered Jackson to spend weekends at the farmhouse with Brenda. The chronic insomnia stripped away my appetite, and I dropped 15 pounds in 2 months. My clothes hung loose on my frame, a physical manifestation of the attrition warfare Wyatt was waging. The exhaustion bled into my career. As a cybersecurity analyst, my value relies entirely on sharp focus and the ability to detect faint anomalies in endless streams of data. I missed a critical vulnerability patch on a regional bank server. A minor breach occurred, costing the client thousands of dollars in recovery protocols and severely damaging my professional reputation. My supervisor called me into a virtual meeting and issued a formal written warning citing my steep decline in performance. I was failing at the one thing that provided our only reliable source of income. I spent the nights pacing the narrow hallway of the apartment, trapped in a cycle of sheer, unadulterated frustration. When the pressure became unbearable, I would walk into the bedroom, bury my face in my pillow, and punch the mattress until my knuckles ached and my lungs burned. The injustice of the situation defied all logic. We had done everything right to survive. We built a quiet life. We asked them for nothing. Yet the legal system favored the wealthy father regardless of his documented cruelty and abandonment. Wyatt did not want to raise Jackson. He wanted to secure his high society wedding to Savannah by legally erasing the scandal of a hidden child. He wanted to force Clara into signing a settlement that would grant him superficial custody rights and a gag order ensuring Savannah's old money family never learned the truth about his past behavior. He was using the courts to buy a clean reputation. Our combative lawyer did her best to stall his motions, but she delivered a sobering reality check during a late evening phone call. The judge presiding over our case was a conservative traditionalist who strongly favored granting joint custody to fathers with substantial financial means. Our narrative of abandonment was compelling, but without hard, concrete evidence of Wyatt's unfitness, the judge would likely mandate shared custody and order Jackson to spend significant time on the Lawson farm. The realization felt like a physical blow to the chest. We could not outspend the Lawson estate. We could not outlast their legal maneuvers. Defending ourselves against their fabricated claims was a losing battle of attrition. Playing by the rules of the family court system was going to cost Clara her son and cost me my sanity. I realized that trying to prove Clara's competence was the wrong strategy. We needed to stop defending our small apartment and start attacking the foundation of Wyatt's immaculate public image. I needed to shift the battlefield from the slow, subjective realm of family law into the cold, unforgiving territory of financial forensics. If Wyatt wanted to use his wealth as a weapon to take Jackson, I was going to turn that wealth into a trap. I stopped pacing the hallway. I walked over to the desk, booted up my primary terminal, and pulled the encrypted hard drive out from under my bed. It was time to stop playing defense and unleash the digital leverage I had kept hidden for over 2 years. The wedding invitations were already mailed. High-quality cardstock with gold foil lettering arrived in mailboxes across the county. Savannah and Wyatt were scheduled to exchange vows at a pristine hunting lodge on the first Saturday in October. Our lawyer submitted a formal request to postpone the custody proceedings until after the ceremony, arguing that the chaotic environment of a high society wedding was detrimental to a toddler. The judge denied the motion. He cited a preference for swift resolution regarding the welfare of the child. The reality was simple. The judge golfed at the same country club as Savannah's father. The Arkansas legal system was closing ranks around its own. We were out of money, out of time, and out of options within the standard judicial framework. I stopped waiting for the court to grant us mercy. I called our lawyer and instructed her to halt all defensive filings. Every motion she drafted drained our remaining cash, and we were bleeding out. I contacted my supervisor at the cybersecurity firm and requested 2 weeks of unpaid leave. He approved it reluctantly, citing my recent performance drop. I did not care about the corporate ladder anymore. I locked the apartment deadbolt, pulled the heavy blackout curtains tight across the windows, and converted my living room into a digital war room. I crawled under my bed and pulled out the heavy Fireproof strongbox. The encrypted hard drive rested inside, cold and heavy, in my palm. 2 years ago, during the rushed, uncontested divorce, I cataloged a series of unexplained cash withdrawals from their joint accounts. Wyatt had siphoned capital in precise increments. $4,000 on a Tuesday, $7,000 the following month. He kept every transaction strictly under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. In the financial sector, this tactic is called smurfing. It is a deliberate method designed to evade automated banking alerts and government scrutiny. I had preserved those digital breadcrumbs knowing we might need them. The time for waiting was over. I booted up my primary workstation. The cooling fans whirred to life, a steady mechanical hum filling the cramped apartment. Clara sat on the floor near the sofa, rolling a plastic toy truck back and forth for Jackson. Her eyes were hollow, stripped of hope by the relentless legal assault. She thought we were going to lose him. I looked at my nephew, watching his small fingers grip the red plastic truck. I was not going to let a corrupt system hand that boy over to a man who discarded him for a clean slate. I cracked my knuckles, opened a secure terminal window, and began the audit. Wyatt was a wealthy agricultural heir, not a sophisticated hacker. He possessed the arrogance of a man who believed money made him untouchable, but he lacked the technical literacy to truly cover his tracks. He assumed that converting cash into cryptocurrency made it invisible. He did not understand that blockchain technology functions as a permanent, unalterable public ledger. If you know the specific wallet address and the transaction timestamps, you can trace the digital currency across the globe. I utilized advanced packet analyzers and proprietary open-source intelligence tools I normally reserved for tracking hostile foreign ransomware syndicates. The initial entry point was easy to locate. Wyatt used a popular domestic cryptocurrency exchange to purchase Bitcoin. He linked the account to a secondary email address, one he registered under a fake name, but accessed using the IP address assigned to the main farmhouse router. He left a glaring digital footprint, but then he tried to be clever. To obscure the final destination of the funds, he routed the Bitcoin through a mixing service. A tumbler is a digital protocol that scrambles various transactions together, churning the currency and spitting it out into new wallets to break the tracing chain. Untangling that scrambled data was a brutal, exhausting process. I sat in my desk chair for 3 days. I barely slept. I lived on black coffee and stale toast. My eyes burned from staring at lines of hexadecimal code scrolling across 3 monitors. I mapped the transactional outputs, cross-referencing timestamps and fractional currency amounts. It was like attempting to reconstruct a shattered pane of glass by examining the microscopic stress fractures on each individual shard. Clara watched me work in silence, bringing me fresh water and taking Jackson into the bedroom when his toddler tantrums threatened to break my concentration. On the morning of the 4th day, the fractured digital chain clicked into place. The scattered Bitcoin converged into a single static location. The trail ended at a cold storage wallet hosted on a secure server situated in the Cayman Islands. A classic offshore digital vault utilized by individuals looking to hide assets beyond the reach of domestic subpoenas. I ran the conversion algorithm to calculate the current market value of the stored currency. The numbers flashed green on my center monitor. $140,000. Wyatt had not just been careless. He had orchestrated a systematic long-term theft from his own marriage. He drained the joint accounts over 2 years to ensure Clara lacked the financial resources to hire a lawyer when he finally initiated the divorce. He starved her out. He funneled the marital wealth into an offshore shadow account, intending to retrieve it once he secured his new unencumbered life with Savannah. He committed this fraud while Clara was buying discounted groceries and struggling to manage the farm payroll. I opened a new browser window and accessed the Arkansas State Legal Code. During the mandatory discovery phase of their expedited divorce, Wyatt and his expensive legal team submitted a sworn financial affidavit. He signed a legally binding document under oath declaring he had disclosed all shared assets and capital. In the state of Arkansas, intentionally hiding marital assets during discovery is a severe form of perjury. It opens the door to crippling civil penalties and the immediate reversal of the original divorce decree. But the civil perjury was just the beginning. Wyatt had moved $140,000 of untaxed capital into an offshore account. That elevated the crime from a state-level domestic dispute into a federal jurisdiction. Concealing that level of wealth triggers the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The IRS does not care about your local country club connections or your status in the Fayetteville agricultural scene. They care about tax evasion. Federal tax fraud carries mandatory prison sentences and catastrophic asset forfeitures. I sat back in my chair. The exhaustion in my bones was instantly replaced by a sharp, cold surge of adrenaline. We did not need to beg the biased family court judge for mercy. We did not need to prove Clara was a fit mother by displaying our cramped square footage. We had the ultimate leverage. Wyatt was using his wealth as a shield to steal his son. I was going to use his hidden wealth as a guillotine. I downloaded the complete audit logs, the blockchain trace maps, and the IP address verifications. I compiled the evidence into a comprehensive, irrefutable dossier. I transferred the files onto a secure encrypted USB drive. I printed hard copies of the most damning ledger transfers and placed them inside a thick manila folder. I held the folder in my hands, feeling the physical weight of my brother's arrogance. Having the data was the first step. Delivering the ultimatum required physical confrontation. I could not hand this to our lawyer and wait for a sluggish court date. Wyatt needed to understand the exact nature of the trap he was standing in before he walked down the aisle and merged his liabilities with Savannah's old money family. I needed to look him in the face away from his expensive attorneys and present the terms of his surrender. I picked up my phone and drafted a short text message to his personal number demanding a meeting. The digital audit was complete, but the real-world execution was going to be volatile and dangerous. The drive north from Little Rock to Fayetteville took 3 hours. I spent the entire journey running through the confrontation in my head, attempting to script my responses the same way I would code an automated defense protocol. The Ozark terrain grew steeper and the highways curved through dense forests, a geographical reminder that I was re-entering Lawson territory. I agreed to meet Wyatt at a popular barbecue joint situated just south of the university campus. The establishment catered to alumni donors, wealthy agricultural executives, and frat boys, spending their trust funds during the autumn football rush. The air outside was thick with the suffocating humidity of late summer. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the restaurant and the interior climate control hit me like a frozen wall. The dining room was loud, filled with the clatter of heavy ceramic plates and a booming jukebox playing upbeat country anthems. The heavy scent of smoked hickory and charred brisket permeated the air. Usually that smell brings back memories of childhood summers on the farm. Sitting on the porch while my dad tended the smoker. Today, the thick, greasy aroma made my stomach turn, twisting the nervous energy in my gut into pure physical nausea. I found Wyatt sitting in a corner booth flanked by brick walls covered in framed collegiate sports memorabilia and neon beer signs. He sat with his back to the wall, occupying the space like he owned the building. He wore a crisp, light blue polo shirt, his hair styled to project an effortless, rustic wealth. My brother spent his entire life insulated from the negative outcomes of his own choices. Brenda shielded him from every failure, ensuring he only knew the mechanics of victory. He viewed people as seasonal farm equipment. You lease them, run them into the ground during the harvest, and trade them in for a newer model when the engine starts knocking. He looked entirely unbothered by the legal warfare currently bankrupting the mother of his child. He was scrolling through a sports application on his phone when I slid into the booth across from him. The red vinyl seat stuck to the back of my thighs. He did not offer a greeting. He locked his phone, placed it face down on the sticky table, and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood. He delivered his terms with the casual arrogance of a man negotiating a minor land dispute over a property line. "Tell Clara to drop the custody block, Soph," he said, keeping his voice low to avoid carrying over the loud music. "This whole defensive legal strategy is ridiculous, and it is dragging out my timeline. I am willing to pay her off. I will cut a check tomorrow to cover whatever debts she accumulated down in the city. But the boy is coming to the wedding. Savannah's family needs to see the heir. We need to present a united front, and Clara needs to accept her role and step aside." I stared at him. The audacity of his demands stole the breath right out of my lungs. He was attempting to purchase his own son to use as a prop for his high society coronation. I had spent 3 days staring at hexadecimal code compiling an airtight federal tax fraud dossier. I had rehearsed this exact moment in my cramped apartment a dozen times. I meant to deliver a cold, calculated threat. I intended to slide the digital evidence across the table like a seasoned corporate auditor, detached and untouchable. I wanted to watch his arrogant smirk slowly dissolve into panic as he realized the magnitude of his digital vulnerability. Instead, my physical body betrayed my logic. The raw trauma of the neonatal intensive care unit, the exhaustion of the home evaluations, and the sheer panic of financial ruin crashed into my throat. My hands began to shake. The trembling started in my wrists and traveled straight up into my shoulders, a visible and humiliating loss of control. I opened my mouth to speak, but the calculated words caught on the jagged edges of my exhaustion. "You do not," I stammered, my voice thin and reedy. "You do not get to buy your way out of abandoning her. You left her with nothing." Wyatt tilted his head, a patronizing smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He looked at my unstyled hair, the dark circles under my eyes, and the plain gray t-shirt I wore. "You are acting like a dramatic spinster, Sophia," he sneered, picking up his glass of ice water. "You always want to play the martyr. Just take the payout and go back to your little computers. Let the adults handle the real world." The insult hit a nerve so deep and raw that my rational mind simply shut down. The clinical detached cybersecurity analyst vanished. The loyal, exhausted sister who had sacrificed her entire future took control. I did not think about the social setting. I did not care about the crowded dining room or the alumni donors eating ribs in the adjacent booths. I grabbed my tall glass of iced sweet tea. I gripped the condensation-slicked glass and hurled the entire contents directly at his chest. The impact was loud. The ice cubes shattered against his crisp polo shirt, spraying frozen shards across the table. The dark brown liquid soaked his collar, dripping down his neck and pooling in the center of his chest. Wyatt gasped, recoiling hard against the vinyl backrest. His chair squeaked harshly against the floorboards. The sudden noise and the visual chaos caused the entire restaurant to stop. The clatter of silverware ceased. Conversations flatlined. Every patron sitting within a 50-foot radius turned to stare at our booth. Wyatt stared down at his ruined shirt, his face flushing a deep mottled red as the humiliation registered. "I am the one who kept your kid alive in the NICU while you were out tailgating, you arrogant coward," I shouted. My voice cracked humiliatingly loud, echoing off the brick walls stripped of all dignity but laced with unfiltered truth. "You dumped your wife like trash, and now you want to buy your son back for a photo op." He opened his mouth to retaliate, his jaw rigid with fury, but I did not give him the space to mount a defense. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the encrypted USB drive. It was encased in a heavy metal shell. I raised my hand and slammed the drive onto the sticky wooden table with enough force to rattle the remaining silverware. "There is a digital ledger on that drive," I said, my breathing ragged and fast. "It contains every single hidden transfer, the offshore Cayman accounts, the $140,000 you siphoned out of your marriage and hid from the discovery phase. You committed federal tax fraud, Wyatt. Plug that drive into your computer tonight. Read the audit. Then call your expensive lawyers and ask them what the IRS does to perjurers." I turned my back on him. I did not wait to see his reaction. I did not care about the stains on the table or the stunned stares of the Fayetteville locals watching my exit. I walked out of the barbecue joint, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping back into the suffocating August heat. My hands were still shaking, but the trembling was no longer born of fear. It was the adrenaline of a direct, irreversible strike. The digital guillotine was officially armed and resting on his side of the board. But Wyatt was a cornered animal, and cornered animals do not surrender. They lash out. His legal team was going to interpret my outburst as a sign of mental instability, and they were preparing a counterattack designed to bypass the court entirely. We had just initiated a high-stakes game of chicken, and the collision date was rapidly approaching. The adrenaline from the barbecue joint sustained me for the entire 3-hour drive back to Little Rock. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, but the fear was gone. I had deployed the payload. Wyatt had the encrypted drive, and the countdown clock was ticking. I parked in the alley behind my apartment building, locked the deadbolt, and collapsed onto the lumpy sofa. I slept for the first time in weeks. The shrill ring of my cell phone woke me just past 9 in the morning. The caller identification displayed the name of our combative family law attorney. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and answered the call. Her tone was remarkably different from our previous conversations. The grim, practical pessimism had vanished, replaced by the sharp, eager energy of a litigator who just received a winning hand. Wyatt's legal team had contacted her office 20 minutes after they opened their doors. The arrogant demands for mandatory paternity testing and emergency custody had evaporated overnight. Wyatt had plugged the USB drive into his computer. He had read the offshore ledger traces. The realization of his federal tax exposure had triggered a sheer panic within his camp. His lawyers were suddenly desperate to negotiate a private, out-of-court settlement. They drafted a preliminary term sheet and sent it over for our review. The offer was staggering compared to our current reality. Wyatt was willing to cover all accumulated medical debts from the intensive care unit. He was offering a generous monthly child support stipend funded through an irrevocable trust. Furthermore, he agreed to grant Clara full physical and legal custody of Jackson, abandoning his demands to bring the boy to Fayetteville. Our lawyer presented the terms as a total victory. She advised us to sign the paperwork, take the financial security, and walk away from the Lawson family forever. On paper, it looked like salvation. It looked like the end of the nightmare. But my training in threat assessment requires looking beyond the immediate patch to identify the long-term structural vulnerability. I read the term sheet on my laptop screen, scanning the dense paragraphs until I found the poison pill. To secure the trust fund and the custody surrender, Clara was required to sign a comprehensive ironclad non-disclosure agreement. She would be legally bound to never discuss the circumstances of the divorce, the hidden offshore accounts, or the abandonment. If we accepted the private settlement, we were accepting hush money. We were giving Wyatt exactly what he wanted. He would secure his pristine public image just in time for his high society wedding. He would marry Savannah, merge his assets with her old money family, and continue living as the honorable Ozark patriarch. Brenda would retain her flawless reputation among the Fayetteville elite. I explained the structural flaw to our lawyer. If Brenda kept her reputation, she kept her social power. A trust fund managed by the Lawson estate meant Brenda remained financially tethered to Jackson's life. In a few years, when Savannah inevitably struggled to produce a male heir, Brenda would grow restless. She would use her limitless wealth and her unblemished public standing to petition the court for grandparent visitation rights. She would hire new lawyers, break the settlement, and terrorize Clara all over again. A private settlement was just a temporary bandage over a bleeding artery. We did not just need a settlement check. We needed a permanent shield. We needed to ensure that no judge in the state of Arkansas would ever grant Brenda or Wyatt access to my nephew. To achieve that, we needed the financial fraud and the perjury to be a matter of public judicial record. We needed federal consequences. I instructed our lawyer to reject the settlement offer in its entirety. I told her to file a sealed motion with the Pulaski County Court, requesting an immediate modification of the original divorce decree based on newly discovered criminal financial fraud. We submitted the digital audit, the offshore IP traces, and the blockchain ledgers as official exhibits. Our lawyer warned me that rejecting the settlement was a massive gamble, but she drafted the motion and filed it with the court clerk that afternoon. We had bypassed the negotiation table and gone straight to the judge. The bureaucratic reality of the judicial system intervened the following week. The Arkansas family courts are drowning in backlogs, handling hundreds of dockets every month. The clerk processed our sealed motion and assigned a preliminary hearing date based on the earliest available slot on the calendar. Our lawyer called to deliver the schedule. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in late October. The date was exactly 3 weeks after Wyatt and Savannah were scheduled to exchange their vows at the hunting lodge. Wyatt's defense strategy pivoted the moment he received the court notice. He realized the sluggish pace of the judicial system had handed him a lifeline. He ignored our filings. He stopped sending his lawyers to harass Clara. He initiated a strategic stall. He knew that if he could just keep the situation quiet until he reached the altar, the entire dynamic would shift in his favor. Once Wyatt married Savannah, he would merge his liabilities with her family's vast agricultural dealership empire. He would have the financial armor to hire federal tax attorneys and drag the IRS investigation out for years. He would use Savannah's wealth to bury Clara in endless punishing litigation. He assumed he had dodged the bullet. He believed he had won the timeline. I sat at my desk staring at the digital calendar on my monitor. The date of the hunting lodge wedding glowed like a red warning light. A heavy, crushing weight pressed against my ribs. I had fired our best weapon, and the slow machinery of the court allowed Wyatt to step out of the blast radius. I rubbed my temples trying to calculate a new defensive perimeter, but my mind was blank. We were out of legal maneuvers. Clara was sitting at the small dining table behind me. She was not crying. She was not packing her bags in defeat. She was watching her son. Jackson was sitting on a braided rug in the center of the living room floor. He was holding a thick green crayon in his chubby fist. He was pressing hard against the thin paper of a cheap coloring book, tracing the jagged mechanical outline of a farm tractor. Clara had spent her entire childhood bouncing between overcrowded, underfunded foster homes in the Mississippi Delta. She married my brother because she desperately wanted an anchor. She endured Brenda's relentless cruelty because she believed the Ozark farm was the only solid ground she would ever find. She had spent the last 2 years terrified of her own shadow, convinced she was powerless against the Lawson machinery. But as she watched her son coloring the very machine that defined the family that discarded them, her posture shifted. The residual fear evaporated. The desperation vanished. Her shoulders pulled back. Her jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. A maternal ferocity took root in the empty space where her terror used to live. It was a cold, terrifying calm. She realized that playing by the rules of the court system was never going to protect her child. Waiting for a judge to validate her suffering was a luxury she could not afford. The Lawson legacy drew its power from secrecy and public perception. If Wyatt was racing to the altar to hide behind Savannah's wealth, the only way to stop him was to detonate the truth before the vows were exchanged. Clara stood up from the dining table. She walked over to the paper calendar hanging on the refrigerator door. She traced her index finger over the first Saturday in October. She stared at the date for a long moment, the ambient noise of the city traffic drifting through the window. She turned around and looked at me. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for my permission. She delivered a statement carrying a hollow, unbreakable certainty. We are going to the wedding. The ascent into the Ozark Mountains took us far away from the flat concrete grid of Little Rock. The highway narrowed into a winding 2-lane road cutting through dense thickets of ancient pine and oak. The air at this elevation is usually sharp and crisp, but tonight it held a sticky, suffocating humidity that clung to the windshield. We turned onto a private gravel drive flanked by tall stone pillars. At the end of the 2-mile path, the hunting lodge emerged from the timber. It was a staggering structure built from massive cedar logs and riverstone designed to project an image of rustic, untamed wealth. This venue was Brenda Lawson executing her final masterpiece. She orchestrated every square inch of this evening to cement her power and erase the stain of the past 2 years. The parking lot was a sprawling expanse of crushed white gravel packed tight with luxury sports utility vehicles and pristine heavy-duty pickup trucks. These vehicles featured flawless paint jobs and custom leather interiors. They had never hauled feed or navigated muddy pastures. They belonged to the state politicians. The banking executives, the corporate agricultural brokers, and the old money families who dictated the economic current of the northern counties. Brenda climbed her way out of the crushing poverty of the Mississippi Delta floodplains by attaching herself to land ownership. Tonight, she was permanently merging the Lawson acreage with Savannah's generational dealership wealth. The lodge featured towering vaulted ceilings crisscrossed with heavy exposed timber beams. Through the expansive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I watched warm amber light spill out onto the manicured lawns. A live country band was warming up on a wooden stage. The faint twang of an acoustic guitar and the steady rhythmic thump of an upright bass cutting through the dense forest air. This was a fortress built to keep the past buried. We did not secure an invitation to the coronation. I parked my rusted sedan near the outer perimeter of the lot, hiding behind a thick row of tall evergreen shrubs. I killed the engine an hour ago to conserve fuel. The only sounds inside the cramped cabin were the rhythmic ticking of the cooling radiator and the relentless mechanical chirping of the Ozark crickets. The contrast between my faded cloth seats and the opulence radiating from the lodge felt sharp and intentional. My chest was a tight drum. Every time I drew a breath, my ribs pushed against a heavy, suffocating pressure. I gripped the plastic steering wheel so hard my joints ached, running through every possible worst-case scenario. As a cybersecurity analyst, I am trained to predict how a hostile system will react to an unauthorized intrusion. We were about to walk into a room filled with 200 people who possess the financial resources to destroy us. If Wyatt panicked and called the local sheriff, we could be arrested for trespassing. If Brenda rallied the crowd, we could be physically thrown out before the evidence ever saw the light of day. The variables were chaotic and unpredictable. We sat in the stifling heat of the car while the ceremony took place on the western stone terrace. I could not see the altar, but I tracked the progression of the ritual through the ambient noise drifting over the trees. The soft murmur of the crowd settling into their wooden chairs. The instrumental swell of the processional music echoing off the canyon walls, the long stretch of quiet where the vows were exchanged under the twilight sky, and then the sudden erupting wave of applause. The sound carried over the tree line bright and celebratory. The officiant had pronounced them husband and wife. Wyatt had officially secured his legal tether to the old money empire. He assumed he just won the war of attrition. He believed his timeline had outpaced our slow-moving legal filings. I turned my head to check the back seat. Clara was not crying. She was not trembling. 2 years ago, she was a discarded 25-year-old with a high school diploma and zero financial autonomy. She grew up bouncing between overcrowded foster homes in the southern Delta, conditioned to believe that her survival depended on making herself useful to whoever offered a roof. She married Wyatt because the sprawling farmhouse represented the only permanent address she had ever known. When he handed her those trash bags on the porch, she thought her life was over. She was ready to accept her own erasure. But standing in the neonatal intensive care unit, watching her premature son fight for oxygen, rewired her fundamental chemistry. The terrified girl who sought permission to exist burned away in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital cafeteria. The punishing delays of the Arkansas family court system forged the remaining pieces into hardened steel. The panic was gone, leaving only a cold, mechanical precision. She leaned over the infant car seat, her movements smooth and deliberate. Jackson was awake, looking around the dark interior of the sedan with wide, curious eyes. Clara spent an entire week carefully hunting through thrift stores in Little Rock to assemble his outfit for this specific night. He was wearing a tiny navy blue blazer, gray trousers, and a miniature patterned bow tie. She reached out and gently straightened the collar of his white button-down shirt. He had Wyatt's distinct heavy brow ridge and Brenda's stubborn angular chin. He was the undeniable biological heir to the agricultural empire celebrating inside that lodge, currently wearing second-hand cotton in the back of a depreciating sedan. He let out a soft, confused babble, reaching for a stray thread on Clara's sleeve. He was entirely innocent, a pawn in a game he did not ask to play, and Clara was going to ensure he never grew up believing he was a secret. The applause from the terrace died down, replaced by the amplified voice of a master of ceremonies, directing the wealthy guests toward the main reception hall. The structure of the evening was shifting. The formal constraints of the outdoor ceremony were lifting, giving way to the open bar, the catered dinner, and the traditional first dance. This was the vulnerable window. Wyatt and Savannah would take the polished hardwood floor as a united front. Brenda would be positioned near the center of the room, basking in the admiration of her peers, secure in her flawless public image. Clara finished adjusting Jackson's bow tie. She pressed a long, soft kiss to his forehead, closing her eyes for a brief second to gather her strength. She unbuckled the complex safety harness, lifting his sturdy frame out of the car seat and settling him onto her left hip. He rested his head against her shoulder, comfortable and quiet, used to the late-night routines we had established in the city. Clara reached over the center console of the sedan. She picked up the thick manila folder resting on the dashboard. It contained the printed cryptocurrency audit logs, the offshore banking traces, the blockchain ledgers, and the formal notice of the federal tax evasion inquiry. It was the physical manifestation of Wyatt's perjury. It was the digital guillotine reduced to 20 pages of undeniable ink and paper. She did not ask if I was ready. She did not seek reassurance. She pushed the heavy car door open. The thick, humid evening air rushed into the stale cabin, carrying the scent of pine needles, catered roast beef, and expensive perfume. The gravel crunched loudly under her sensible flat shoes. I opened my door and stepped out into the shadows of the parking lot. We were not dressed for a high society gala. I wore dark slacks and a plain blouse. Clara wore a simple, unadorned navy dress. We did not belong in their world, and we were no longer trying to fit into their narrative. We were dressed for a reckoning. We walked side by side toward the grand double doors of the reception hall. The music grew louder with every step, the band playing a slow, sweeping country ballad designed for the newlyweds. The golden light from the lodge illuminated the dust kicking up around our feet. We approached the heavy oak doors, preparing to cross the threshold and introduce the cold, unforgiving reality of the real world to the pristine Lawson fantasy. The heavy oak doors yielded to our combined weight, swinging inward on well-oiled hinges. The air inside the lodge was cooled to a crisp artificial temperature, carrying the rich scent of roasted beef, expensive floral arrangements, and aged bourbon. The reception was in its most vulnerable, sentimental phase. The overhead chandeliers were dimmed, casting a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floor. A 5-piece country band occupied the elevated wooden stage, playing a slow, sweeping ballad dominated by the low hum of a cello and the gentle strum of an acoustic guitar. It was the designated first dance, the traditional centerpiece of any Southern high society union. We did not kick the doors open. We did not shout over the music or throw anything to demand attention. The visual discrepancy of our arrival carried enough volume to stop the room. We were 2 women in plain, dark clothing stepping into a sea of pastel silk-tailored tuxedos and glittering jewelry. The guest list represented the entrenched power structures of the northern counties. There were regional bank presidents who approved agricultural loans, conservative circuit court judges who ruled on land disputes, and prominent equipment dealers who played golf with Savannah's father. These were the very individuals who had eagerly absorbed Brenda's fabricated narrative for 2 years. They believed Clara was a fragile failure who cracked under pressure. It started with a single guest standing near the coat check. A woman in a silver-beaded dress turned around, noticed Clara, and nudged her husband. He looked, his jaw dropping in genuine shock. The recognition spread outward in concentric circles. The murmurs began low, a soft rustling sound that multiplied and traveled across the room like a fast-moving fire consuming dry brush. Heads turned, shoulders shifted. The conversations about crop yields, stock portfolios, and upcoming political races died in the throats of the attendees. The bass player on the stage noticed the shifting attention of the crowd. His fingers fumbled a note, creating a harsh, discordant twang. The lead singer glanced toward the back of the room, lost his place in the lyrics, and the melody stumbled into a disorganized, fading hum. Brenda was positioned near the far wall, presiding over a tiered wedding cake covered in white fondant and cascading sugar roses. This evening was her ultimate monument to the Lawson legacy. She had successfully orchestrated the permanent merger of her Ozark timber acreage with the largest heavy machinery fortune in the state. She was holding a crystal champagne flute, engaging a state senator in conversation, secure in her flawless public execution. She had spent 30 years fortifying her social standing to ensure she never returned to the poverty of the Mississippi Delta, and tonight was her crowning achievement. The sudden faltering of the band caused her to turn her head. She looked past the scattered tables and locked onto our position by the entrance. Her posture stiffened. She recognized Clara immediately. The annoyance of an unwanted guest registered on her features, a tight narrowing of her lips, a brief flash of irritation that someone dared to interrupt her meticulous schedule. Then her gaze dropped lower. Jackson was standing on the hardwood floor, holding tightly to Clara's left hand. The ambient light caught his features perfectly. The square jaw, the wide-set eyes, the distinct shape of his brow. He was wearing his tiny navy blazer and a miniature patterned bow tie. He was the undeniable living biological blueprint of the man currently standing on the dance floor. He was the Lawson heir standing in the flesh, destroying 2 years of carefully curated lies just by breathing the air in the room. Brenda's fingers went slack. The crystal flute slipped from her grasp. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering fragments. The resonant crash of breaking glass cut through the hushed room, snapping the remaining tension like a brittle wire. Champagne splashed across the polished toes of her expensive heels, but she did not look down. Her face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as the foundation of her reputation crumbled. The sound of the shattering glass reached the center of the room. Savannah paused her steps, her white silk gown swirling around her ankles, coming to a halt. She looked toward her new mother-in-law, confused by the sudden disruption of their spotlight moment. Wyatt turned his head to follow her gaze. He looked past the broken glass, past the tiered cake, and found us standing at the edge of the dance floor. The blood drained from Wyatt's face in an instant, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray under the warm amber lighting. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the mechanical click. His rustic, confident persona evaporated. The wealthy, untouchable agricultural heir who had smirked at me in the barbecue joint was replaced by a terrified perjurer caught in the glaring spotlight of his own fraud. Savannah looked at him, registering his sudden terror, and then traced his line of sight toward the entrance. Clara did not march toward the stage with the frantic energy of a wronged victim. She did not raise her voice to address the whispering crowd or demand their sympathy. She possessed a terrifying, hollow calm. She squeezed Jackson's hand gently, offering him a reassuring touch, and began to walk. The wealthy guests parted instinctively, creating a wide, clear path through the center of the reception hall. It was the parting of a sea built on status and privilege, yielding to the raw, undeniable force of a mother who had survived their cruelty. As a cybersecurity analyst, I spend my life identifying systemic vulnerabilities. I was watching a closed, secure social network experience, a catastrophic failure in real time. The defensive walls Brenda had built around her family were useless against physical proof. The attendees who normally dictated the social and economic flow of the region were paralyzed. They did not know how to process the anomaly of Clara's presence. Clara walked past a table of elderly women who had undoubtedly gossiped about her supposed mental breakdown at country club luncheons. She did not glance at them. 2 years ago, on the sweltering porch of the farmhouse, she had begged Wyatt for an explanation while he handed her garbage bags. Tonight, she required no explanations. The punishing delays of the Arkansas family court system and the terror of the intensive care unit had burned the desperation out of her. She held the thick manila folder in her right hand, her grip steady and firm. Her sensible flat shoes made a soft, rhythmic sound against the wood. I walked 3 paces behind her, watching the peripheral reactions. I saw local politicians avert their eyes in discomfort. I saw the wives of prominent landowners cover their mouths in shock. Savannah's parents standing near the front table stepped forward, their faces clouded with rising confusion and deep concern. Clara stepped directly onto the dance floor. The boundary separating the marginalized outcast from the center of Ozark power was breached. She did not stop until she was mere feet away from the newlyweds. Wyatt tried to step backward, a physical reflex to escape the incoming threat, but his heavy dress shoes seemed glued to the floorboards. Savannah dropped his hands, creating a distinct physical distance between them as she stared at the toddler standing next to the woman she was told was a fragile failure. The collision was no longer a theoretical legal filing waiting in a sluggish court docket. The offshore accounts, the tax evasion, the neonatal intensive care bills, and the forced discard had all materialized in the center of the room. Clara brought the truth into his sanctuary, forcing him to face the very reality he had utilized every ounce of his wealth to legally erase. The music was gone. The whispers had ceased. The room waited suspended in a tense, breathless vacuum for the detonation. Clara halted her steps precisely 3 feet away from the groom. The distance was calculated and deliberate, placing her just outside his immediate physical reach, but well within the intimate perimeter of the newlyweds. The sprawling reception hall, previously vibrating with live country music and overlapping conversations, dropped into a sudden and suffocating vacuum. The band had stopped playing entirely. The only sound remaining in the vast space was the low, steady mechanical drone of the industrial air conditioning units, cycling cold air through the overhead cedar vents. 200 guests held their collective breath, their gaze pinned to the center of the hardwood floor. Savannah stood on Wyatt's right side, her custom white silk gown glowing under the amber chandeliers. She was raised in an environment where flawless reputation was the most valuable currency a family could possess. Her father sold millions of dollars in agricultural machinery based on handshake agreements and pristine lineages. She had spent her entire life shielded from public scandal, groomed to host charity auctions and smile for local magazine features. She was not equipped to navigate a high society disaster. She looked at Wyatt, observing the terrified ashen pallor of his skin. Then her eyes darted downward to Jackson. The toddler was holding tightly to Clara's hand, looking around the vast room with mild, innocent curiosity. His features were a perfect biological mirror of the groom. The realization hit Savannah with a visible physical force. Her chest began to heave, the delicate fabric of her bodice rising and falling in rapid, erratic intervals. She took a distinct, deliberate step backward, creating a noticeable gap between herself and her new husband. She was severing the visual association, instinctively recoiling from the incoming blast radius. Clara did not look at Savannah. She kept her focus entirely on Wyatt. She looked him dead in the center of his face, bypassing his frantic, searching gaze. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not demand an explanation or a sudden display of remorse. The trembling, broken girl who had sat on the linoleum floor of my bathroom 2 years ago was gone. In her place stood a woman who had navigated the terrifying corridors of a neonatal intensive care unit and survived the punishing delays of the Pulaski County legal system. She spoke with a terrifying, hollow calm. Her voice carried across the silent room clear and unbothered, cutting through the ambient hum of the ventilation system. "You told me my body was a dead end." Clara stated the words, dropping like stones onto the polished floorboards. "You were wrong." Wyatt opened his mouth perhaps to offer a whispered excuse or beg for a private conversation, but his vocal cords failed him. He produced a weak, breathless sound, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. The wealthy, untouchable agricultural heir had been reduced to a cornered animal trapped under the glare of 100 spectators. Clara lifted her right arm and extended the thick manila folder toward his chest. Wyatt took it automatically, his fingers grasping the heavy paper as if propelled by blind reflex. He did not know what he was holding. He likely assumed it contained standard family court filings, perhaps an emergency custody petition, or a demand for backdated child support. He was conditioned to view Clara as a nuisance he could manage with his high-priced attorneys. He had no concept of the digital forensics I had executed in my apartment. "That does not contain custody papers," Clara said, maintaining the exact same even pitch. "It contains a formal notice from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Our lawyer secured special judicial authorization to legally serve you via this public delivery. Consider yourself served." The whispered murmurs in the front rows of the audience spiked. The guests in the immediate vicinity heard the acronym. In the world of wealthy landowners and corporate agricultural brokers, the IRS is the ultimate apex predator. It is a force that cannot be bribed, delayed, or charmed at a country club luncheon. Clara continued her verbal execution, ensuring her voice reached the front tables where Savannah's parents and the local politicians sat. The folder details the pending federal audit and the immediate asset freeze regarding the $140,000 you siphoned out of our marriage. You hid the capital in an offshore cryptocurrency wallet housed in the Cayman Islands. You signed a sworn financial affidavit during the mandatory discovery phase of our expedited divorce. Claiming you had disclosed all assets, you committed severe perjury and federal tax evasion to starve me out. Wyatt stared down at the manila envelope in his trembling hands. The staggering reality of his exposure settled over him. He was not just facing public embarrassment, he was facing a comprehensive federal forensic audit of his entire estate, the freezing of his operational capital, and the very real threat of mandatory minimum prison sentences. His clean slate had morphed into an inescapable federal snare. The sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the light from the chandeliers. "During that same rushed divorce, you demanded a binding waiver." Clara stated her words sharp and precise. "You signed away all your rights to any undisclosed dependents to protect your precious bank accounts. You legally severed your ties to a son you were too arrogant to realize existed." She paused, letting the legal reality of his own paperwork wash over the room. Wyatt had spent months using the Arkansas family courts to terrorize her, threatening to take Jackson away to save his reputation. But he had built his own prison. By hiding his money and signing that waiver, he had legally forfeited any claim to the child standing before him. The irony was total and unyielding. Clara took a single step backward, pulling Jackson slightly closer to her leg. The toddler looked up at his mother, oblivious to the fact that his mere presence had just dismantled a 40-year legacy of Ozark greed. Jackson let out a soft babble, pointing a small finger at the shiny lapel of Wyatt's tuxedo jacket. The innocence of the gesture stood in stark contrast to the heavy, suffocating sins of the adults surrounding him. "We do not want your money, Wyatt," Clara said, delivering the final crushing blow to his pride. "And we do not want your farm. Keep the acreage. We are done with you." She did not wait for a response. She did not need one. The truth had been detonated in the exact center of his fortress. The burden of secrecy was gone, transferred entirely onto the shoulders of the man who had created it. Wyatt stood paralyzed on the dance floor, holding the manila folder that contained his financial ruin. The social and legal reckoning had finally arrived, and there was no back door left to escape through. Wyatt stood immobilized. The manila folder rested in his palms like a live explosive. He did not possess the cognitive function to open it or deny its contents. Savannah broke the paralysis. She reached across the void separating them and snatched the heavy envelope from his hands. Her sudden movement caused the thick paper to rustle sharply, a dry and scraping sound that echoed across the polished floorboards. She pulled the top document from the stack. The stark black ink of the federal letterhead contrasted sharply against her pristine white silk gown. Savannah was born into a regional dealership dynasty. Her family built their fortune leasing heavy agricultural machinery to corporate farms across 3 states. That level of generational wealth requires immaculate accounting and a pristine public facade. They despised local scandal, but they harbored a deep, visceral terror of federal tax audits. An investigation by the Internal Revenue Service does not merely examine the individual target. It extends its reach into every associated business partner, every joint account, and every spousal asset. Savannah's eyes darted back and forth across the typed paragraphs. She read the specific dollar amounts, the offshore routing descriptions, and the undeniable declaration of criminal perjury. Her breathing turned shallow and rapid. The romantic illusion of a rustic Ozark fairy tale burned away in a matter of seconds, replaced by the terrifying calculus of financial liability. By marrying Wyatt, she was legally tethering herself and her family's immaculate corporate empire to a man currently targeted by a federal tax evasion inquiry. She lowered the paper. Her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust, her upper lip curling as if the document itself emitted a foul odor. She looked at Wyatt, the man she intended to build a flawless social calendar alongside. "You hid a child and committed perjury," Savannah whispered. Her voice lacked volume but carried a sharp, piercing clarity that reached the front row of tables. The disgust in her tone was not solely focused on the moral failure of abandoning an infant. It was rooted in the unforgivable sin of exposing her family to federal scrutiny. Wyatt opened his mouth, extending a trembling hand toward her wrist, desperate to offer an excuse, or a promise, to fix the unfixable. Savannah stepped out of his reach. She opened her fingers and let the manila folder drop. The heavy envelope hit the hardwood floor, spilling the printed blockchain ledgers and the offshore banking traces across the polished wood. The pages fanned out, settling around the toes of his expensive leather dress shoes. Savannah turned her back on him. She did not raise her voice or demand an apology. She gathered the heavy silk fabric of her gown in one hand, lifted her chin, and walked directly toward the exit. Her bridesmaids, still clustered near the entrance, parted seamlessly to let her pass. Her parents rose from their prominent seats at the head table and followed their daughter out of the reception hall without looking back. The merger of the Ozark timber acreage and the machinery fortune dissolved before the catered dinner was even served. Wyatt was left standing alone in the center of the dance floor, staring down at the scattered papers. The social execution was swift and irreversible. The quiet shock gripping the room shattered a moment later. Brenda found her voice. The realization that her pristine legacy was collapsing pushed her past the point of social preservation. She operated on the sheer desperate instinct of a cornered predator. She pushed away from the tiered wedding cake, her heels crunching loudly over the shattered remains of her crystal champagne flute. She charged through the crowd of paralyzed guests. Her face flushed a deep mottled red, the veins in her neck straining against her skin. The carefully curated persona of the gracious, hospitable matriarch vanished. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Clara. "You ruined this family." Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted cedar ceilings. The polished attendees flinched at the raw, unfiltered volume. "You vindictive, ungrateful girl, you plotted this. You waited until tonight to destroy my son. You are nothing but a parasite trying to drag the Lawson name through the mud." Clara did not step back. She stood her ground, her posture straight in her simple navy dress, her hand still holding firmly to Jackson. She allowed the frantic accusations to wash over her, entirely unaffected by the noise. The screaming only highlighted Brenda's loss of control. The wealthy onlookers watched the matriarch unravel, their previous admiration replaced by distinct, undeniable pity. Brenda closed the distance, her hands balled into tight fists, preparing to unleash another barrage of insults. She never reached the dance floor. Dale stepped out from the shadows near the catering stations. My father moved with the slight, uneven limp he had carried for 30 years, a permanent physical reminder of the farming accident that nearly cost him his life. Brenda had nursed him through that trauma, managed the farm hands, and kept the bank away from their land. Dale had traded his voice for his survival, allowing her to dictate every term of their existence to repay that debt. He had stood by the tractor inspecting a tire while Clara was thrown out with garbage bags. He had watched in silence for decades. But the sight of his own grandson standing in the crossfire wearing a second-hand suit while his family imploded under the weight of federal fraud tipped the balance. The debt was finally canceled. Dale intercepted Brenda. He stepped directly into her path, utilizing his heavy, weathered frame as a physical barricade. Brenda collided with his chest, letting out a sharp gasp of surprise. She tried to step around him, her eyes still locked on Clara, but Dale raised his hands and clamped them firmly onto her shoulders. His grip halted her forward momentum. Brenda looked up at him, her face twisting in confusion and outrage. She opened her mouth to order him out of the way. "Enough, Brenda," Dale said. His voice was rough, carrying a deep, gravelly resonance that had not been heard in that household in 3 decades. It lacked anger, replaced instead by a profound, exhausted resignation. She struggled against his hold, her perfectly styled hair falling loose around her face. "Let me go, Dale. She is destroying everything we built. She is tearing the farm apart. We brought this on ourselves," he replied, his tone lowering to a steady, immovable register. He did not look at Clara. He did not look at Jackson. He kept his gaze locked on his wife, forcing her to absorb the reality of their own actions. "The boy is Wyatt's. The money was hidden. We let it happen. Stop screaming. It is over." The finality in his voice drained the remaining fight from Brenda's posture. Her shoulders slumped under his hands. The realization that even her most loyal, silent enabler had recognized the truth broke the last pillar of her delusion. She stopped struggling, her breathing ragged and uneven, staring at the floorboards in front of her husband's boots. The reception hall remained trapped in a stunned, breathless paralysis. The guests stood by their tables witnessing the definitive end of a regional dynasty. The timber acreage remained, but the social power, the influence, and the flawless reputation were gone, scattered on the floor alongside the IRS audit notices. Clara did not linger to enjoy the wreckage. She had delivered the truth, and the objective was complete. She bent her knees, maintaining a smooth, deliberate motion, and scooped Jackson up from the floor. She settled him onto her left hip, supporting his weight with effortless familiarity. He rested his head against her shoulder, his small hands grasping the fabric of her navy dress. He was tired, ready for the quiet routine of our cramped apartment, entirely untouched by the venom of the Ozark elite. Clara turned her back on Wyatt, on Brenda, and on the shattered remains of the wedding reception. She did not offer a parting remark or a triumphant smile. She simply began to walk. I followed a step behind her, my dark slacks and plain blouse blending into the shadows as we moved toward the exit. The crowd of wealthy landowners and local politicians parted for us once again, offering a wide, silent path to the heavy oak doors. We crossed the threshold, stepping out of the harsh, artificial chill of the lodge and back into the humid, living air of the Arkansas night. We walked across the crushed white gravel of the parking lot, the sound of our footsteps loud and rhythmic in the quiet forest. The crickets chirped from the tall evergreen shrubs. The music from the band had never resumed. We reached my rusted sedan, unlatched the doors, and prepared to drive back down the winding mountain roads. The ghost life was over, the battle was finished, and the long, arduous process of building a real future was just beginning. Hollywood conditions us to expect swift and satisfying resolutions. The screen fades to black after the climactic confrontation, and the antagonists vanish into the closing credits, while the heroes breathe a sigh of relief. The American judicial system operates on a different, unyielding frequency. There was no magical overnight fix waiting for us when we returned to Little Rock. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division is a relentless grinding machine. Their forensic auditors do not care about the emotional catharsis of a ruined high society wedding. They care about paper trails rooting numbers and recovering untaxed federal revenue. For 14 agonizing months, we lived in the shadow of a sprawling federal inquiry enduring a grueling waiting game while the government slowly dismantled the Ozark Empire. The immediate consequence of Clara delivering that folder was the total freezing of Wyatt's financial ecosystem. The federal government placed a hard lock on his checking accounts, his investment portfolios, and the operational capital of the timber farm. The high-priced family law attorneys he hired to terrorize Clara required exorbitant monthly retainers to maintain their services. When Wyatt could no longer wire their payments, his ruthless legal representation dropped him without a second thought. He was left navigating a complex federal tax fraud case with a public defender and a frozen bank account. His ability to fund a protracted punishing custody battle evaporated. Savannah did not stay to weather the storm alongside her new husband. Her family treated the scandal like a hazardous chemical spill that threatened to contaminate their pristine dealership empire. They deployed their own team of corporate litigators to sever the association. Within 30 days of the reception hall disaster, the marriage was legally annulled. Savannah returned to her old money social circles, claiming she was the victim of a calculated deception. Her father pulled his corporate sponsorships from any local agricultural event Wyatt attended, executing a thorough social scrubbing. Wyatt lost the political armor and the financial bailout he desperately needed. He was stranded on an island of his own creation, surrounded by the mounting debt of his perjury. The federal prosecutor eventually offered Wyatt a harsh ultimatum. He was facing a potential 5-year prison sentence for the offshore concealment and the fraudulent discovery affidavits he submitted during the divorce. He needed to liquidate assets to pay the staggering federal penalties, but Clara held a critical piece of leverage. Under Arkansas law, she was entitled to file a civil lawsuit for the intentional deprivation of marital property. She possessed the legal standing to seek severe punitive damages that would bankrupt him before the IRS even finished their collection process. Clara did not want his money. She wanted permanent, unassailable freedom for her son. We hired a new attorney specializing in binding contracts and drafted an ironclad agreement. Clara offered to formally waive her right to pursue civil litigation and punitive damages. In exchange, Wyatt was required to sign a voluntary, irrevocable termination of his parental rights. He was cornered. To save himself from federal prison and total financial ruin, he traded his claim to the Lawson bloodline. We met in a sterile, windowless conference room at the county courthouse to finalize the paperwork. Wyatt sat across the table looking hollow and exhausted. He signed the termination documents with a cheap plastic pen, never once lifting his head to look at Clara. A family court judge signed the final order on a quiet Tuesday morning. Clara was granted full sole legal and physical custody of Jackson. Wyatt was permanently erased from their future. Back in the Ozarks, the fallout was equally thorough. Brenda built her entire identity on the perception of her flawless lineage and her unyielding control. The public humiliation at the hunting lodge shattered that illusion. The wealthy politicians and the corporate agricultural brokers stopped returning her calls. Her invitations to the country club charity galas ceased. The isolation she once used as a weapon against Clara was now her own permanent reality. She rarely leaves the farmhouse today, sitting inside a sprawling, silent structure trapped in the Delta legacy she sacrificed her own son to protect. Hollywood conditions us to expect swift and satisfying resolutions. The screen fades to black after the climactic confrontation, and the antagonists vanish into the closing credits, while the heroes breathe a sigh of relief. The American judicial system operates on a different, unyielding frequency. There was no magical overnight fix waiting for us when we returned to Little Rock. The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division is a relentless grinding machine. Their forensic auditors do not care about the emotional catharsis of a ruined high society wedding. They care about paper trails rooting numbers and recovering untaxed federal revenue. For 14 agonizing months, we lived in the shadow of a sprawling federal inquiry, enduring a grueling waiting game while the government slowly dismantled the Ozark Empire. The immediate consequence of Clara delivering that folder was the total freezing of Wyatt's financial ecosystem. The federal government placed a hard lock on his checking accounts, his investment portfolios, and the operational capital of the timber farm. The high-priced family law attorneys he hired to terrorize Clara required exorbitant monthly retainers to maintain their services. When Wyatt could no longer wire their payments, his ruthless legal representation dropped him without a second thought. He was left navigating a complex federal tax fraud case with a public defender and a frozen bank account. His ability to fund a protracted punishing custody battle evaporated. Savannah did not stay to weather the storm alongside her new husband. Her family treated the scandal like a hazardous chemical spill that threatened to contaminate their pristine dealership empire. They deployed their own team of corporate litigators to sever the association. Within 30 days of the reception hall disaster, the marriage was legally annulled. Savannah returned to her old money social circles, claiming she was the victim of a calculated deception. Her father pulled his corporate sponsorships from any local agricultural event Wyatt attended, executing a thorough social scrubbing. Wyatt lost the political armor and the financial bailout he desperately needed. He was stranded on an island of his own creation, surrounded by the mounting debt of his perjury. The federal prosecutor eventually offered Wyatt a harsh ultimatum. He was facing a potential 5-year prison sentence for the offshore concealment and the fraudulent discovery affidavits he submitted during the divorce. He needed to liquidate assets to pay the staggering federal penalties, but Clara held a critical piece of leverage. Under Arkansas law, she was entitled to file a civil lawsuit for the intentional deprivation of marital property. She possessed the legal standing to seek severe punitive damages that would bankrupt him before the IRS even finished their collection process. Clara did not want his money. She wanted permanent, unassailable freedom for her son. We hired a new attorney specializing in binding contracts and drafted an ironclad agreement. Clara offered to formally waive her right to pursue civil litigation and punitive damages. In exchange, Wyatt was required to sign a voluntary, irrevocable termination of his parental rights. He was cornered. To save himself from federal prison and total financial ruin, he traded his claim to the Lawson bloodline. We met in a sterile, windowless conference room at the county courthouse to finalize the paperwork. Wyatt sat across the table looking hollow and exhausted. He signed the termination documents with a cheap plastic pen, never once lifting his head to look at Clara. A family court judge signed the final order on a quiet Tuesday morning. Clara was granted full sole legal and physical custody of Jackson. Wyatt was permanently erased from their future. Back in the Ozarks, the fallout was equally thorough. Brenda built her entire identity on the perception of her flawless lineage and her unyielding control. The public humiliation at the hunting lodge shattered that illusion. The wealthy politicians and the corporate agricultural brokers stopped returning her calls. Her invitations to the country club charity galas ceased. The isolation she once used as a weapon against Clara was now her own permanent reality. She rarely leaves the farmhouse today, sitting inside a sprawling, silent structure trapped in the Delta legacy she sacrificed her own son to protect. The unexpected reckoning, however, came from the man who had spent 30 years wiping grease off his hands in the background. The federal tax liens levied against Wyatt required the liquidation of substantial farm acreage to satisfy the debt. When the government auditors reviewed the original property deeds to prepare for the asset seizure, they uncovered a structural anomaly in the Lawson estate planning. Brenda always assumed the 400 acres belonged to her by virtue of her marriage and her firm grip on the family operations. But the deed was tied to a generational trust established by Dale's grandfather. Dale was the sole legal executor. For decades, he allowed Brenda to act as the sovereign ruler of the land because he owed her his survival after his farming accident. The disaster at the wedding cleared that debt. Dale filed for divorce. He did not engage in a bitter court battle. He quietly cooperated with the federal auditors, permitting them to seize the outer timber tracts to cover his son's federal penalties. Then Dale took the remaining core acreage, including the main farmhouse, and transferred the deed into an irrevocable generation-skipping trust. He named Jackson as the sole beneficiary and appointed Clara as the managing trustee. Brenda was handed a modest alimony settlement and a 60-day eviction notice from the property she had defended with such spiteful cruelty. She was forced to pack her belongings into boxes and leave the land, mirroring the exact method she used to discard Clara 2 years prior. Dale moved into a small, quiet cabin near the state border, choosing a life of solitary fishing over the toxic ambition of his former wife. Jackson owns the legacy Brenda tried to deny him, but he will not be raised in its shadow. We live 200 miles away, operating on our own terms, far removed from the expectations of the Ozark elite. We spent last Sunday afternoon sitting by the banks of the Arkansas River in Little Rock. The summer heat was fading, replaced by a cool, steady breeze rolling off the water. Clara bought a paper basket of fried okra from a local vendor down the street. The thick cornmeal crust and the distinct southern flavor offered a simple, grounding comfort. We sat on a weathered wooden picnic table watching the muddy current cut its path through the Delta Plains. The steady flow of the river stood in sharp contrast to the turbulent years we had just survived. Jackson is 3 years old now. He wore a bright yellow shirt and spent an hour throwing smooth river pebbles into the water, laughing loudly every time a stone broke the surface. He is loud, sturdy, and entirely unaware of the legal warfare fought to secure his safety. He does not know about offshore crypto wallets, federal tax liens, or the crushing weight of old money expectations. He only knows that he is safe. We are not wealthy. We still live in the third-floor walk-up apartment above the noisy intersection. I still work long hours analyzing threat vectors, and Clara manages logistics data from a desk in the living room. We do not have a sprawling timber farm or a multi-million-dollar trust fund to fall back on for our daily expenses. But wealth is a subjective metric. As I sat by the river eating fried okra and listening to my nephew laugh, I realized we had achieved the only victory that mattered. We built a table where no one has to earn their right to exist, and finally that is more than enough. We spend decades laying bricks. We pour concrete, secure the heavy oak doors, and build our fortresses on quiet, tree-lined streets or sprawling acres of prime timber. In the pursuit of the American dream, we are taught that a successful family is one insulated by a flawless reputation, a prestigious zip code, and a bank account thick enough to absorb any shock. We polish the veneer until it shines, convinced that these tangible assets are the ultimate inheritance we can pass down. but there is a distinct sound a legacy makes when it cracks. It does not echo like a falling tree. It sounds like a crystal champagne flute slipping from an unyielding hand and shattering on a polished hardwood floor. The story of the Lawson family is more than a drama unfolding in the Ozarks. It serves as a stark mirror reflecting the spiritual decay that takes root when a family values its curated image over the souls of the people living inside it. As we navigate the complex, often messy realities of raising children, we must pause and examine the architecture of our own homes. Are we building sanctuaries, or are we constructing beautiful gilded cages? To raise a child with wisdom requires piercing through the illusion of the societal scorecard. Many parents unknowingly view their children as extensions of their own ego. A child becomes a trophy to be displayed at country club luncheons, a tool to secure a bloodline, or a proxy to achieve the dreams the parent left unfinished. When worth is tied to what a child can produce for the family name, the parent goes blind to the actual breathing human being standing in front of them. True wisdom is accepting a difficult, humbling truth: you do not own your children. You are simply the steward of the soil in which they grow. If you poison that soil with relentless conditions and heavy expectations, the roots will inevitably rot. A legacy built entirely on material wealth and the applause of local elites is fragile. The only permanent inheritance you can offer is the environment you cultivate, one where a child learns to navigate the world with a steady internal compass, rather than a frantic desire to please an audience. This brings us to the tragedy of conditional love, a failure of morality that quietly destroys traditional family structures from the inside out. The deepest suffering in the modern home arises when love is treated as a transaction. A parent's fundamental duty is to provide a physical and emotional sanctuary, where a child's right to exist is never up for negotiation. When a house operates on transactional affection, it does not create a strong, united lineage. It creates exiles. It breeds children who must pack their bags and drive long, solitary highways, becoming a child living far from home. They spend their holidays staring across a vast, quiet distance at a house that looks beautiful on a postcard, but offers zero actual warmth. Morality in parenting is not defined by enforcing strict curfews or presenting a united front at a holiday dinner. It is the daily, unglamorous practice of unconditional acceptance. It means choosing to protect the vulnerable even when doing so costs you your social standing. The true moral failure is not a loud argument. It is standing quietly by a tractor wiping grease off your hands with an old rag while someone suffers in your own yard. Silence in the face of cruelty is its own distinct form of violence. We must also redefine the architecture of true strength. Modern society frequently confuses financial insulation with resilience. Parents rush to shield their children from the natural consequences of their own reckless actions. They deploy checkbooks, hire expensive lawyers, and leverage their social influence to smooth out every bump in the road, genuinely believing they are protecting their offspring. This story exposes that specific brand of protection as the ultimate parental sabotage. By shielding a child from their own failures, you systematically strip them of the opportunity to develop a spine. The golden child, insulated from hardship and praised for merely existing, inevitably collapses the moment the artificial scaffolding is removed. True resilience cannot be inherited through a generation-skipping trust fund. It is forged in the quiet, agonizing moments of taking responsibility. Resilience is built during late-night shifts typing data at a small desk. It is cultivated in cramped third-floor city apartments where the air conditioning rattles in the window. It is the terrifying, necessary process of standing firmly in the truth when the entire room expects you to lie. The message embedded in this cautionary tale is an urgent call to awaken from the heavy sleep of societal expectations. It is a plea to stop building rigid monuments to your own ego and demanding your children live inside them. A successful parent is not the one who leaves behind a sprawling dealership empire or a flawless reputation in the local community. A successful parent is the one who raises a child capable of sitting by the banks of a muddy river, eating a simple meal of fried okra from a paper basket, and knowing deeply that their worth is inherent, unshakable, and free. They do not need to earn their right to exist. They do not need to perform to secure their place at the table. If this reflection resonates with a quiet truth you have carried, or if you are in the process of building a new table for yourself, take a moment to subscribe to Still Waters Stories. We share narratives that explore the deep, often unspoken currents of family resilience and the journey toward genuine freedom. Join our community and share your thoughts in the comments below. We spend our days measuring our lives in acreage, in bank statements, and in the approving nods of neighbors we barely know. But when the dust settles and the lights in the reception hall finally go dark, the only thing remaining is the quiet truth of who we were to the people who needed us most. You look out at the water watching the current pull the fallen leaves away from the shore, and you have to ask yourself when the time comes to leave the riverbank, what exactly is the weight of the stone you are tossing into the water?